Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Independent Science Board meeting. We apologize for the short delay. We have 8 of our members present here, one of them on the phone, and Jay Lund sends his apologies. He can't make it to this meeting. So let's go around and first have introductions and declarations. I'll start with Joy.
I have to declare it's very hard for me to distinguish all the J names when you say John and Joy and Jay and Joe. Joy said there are no changes.
Vince Resch, no changes.
Dick Norgard, no changes.
Steve Brandt, no changes.
Liz Kenuel, no changes.
Joe Fernando, no changes.
Tracy Collier, no changes.
John Wayne's, no changes.
And Brian?
Brian Atwater, no changes.
Okay, they're moving to, I guess I remind anyone in the public if they have any, want to have some public comment on any of the items, they should come up, and there's a blue form up here to fill to get you in line. In our chair's report, first item is just to announce that our dates for the 2018 meetings have been set, and the board members should have a hard copy of that in front of them, and it's also copies back here for members of the public. Did want to remind people that we start our field trip tomorrow to Suisun Marsh, starting at 7 o'clock, and I certainly did not pick that time. So, but we're supposed to meet at the DWR's West Sacramento office at 3500 Industrial Blvd at 7 a.m. tomorrow, and that'll be an all-day field trip. Another announcement is just we have changed the date of our December meeting, and that's now going to be on December 11th rather than the 14th, and that is a conference call. So we have a very full agenda today, and we have one specific action item to look at our finalizing our report on the CSO amendments. We have a large discussion dealing with the water quality review. We're also have a presentation from folks to give us an introduction to tomorrow's field trip. And then another major discussion is to evaluate and explore the various thematic reviews we might want to take on and try and set some strategic direction over the next couple of years about which ones we might want to go forward with, who might be involved in leading up those efforts, and what the time frame of those might be. So without any further questions or discussion, I'd like to move to and formally again welcome John Calloway as a lead scientist. This is his first time as the sole lead scientist in our meeting, and we've asked him to say a few words about what his vision might be. So, John.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Steve. I have to say, thanks for the welcome. Both from the Independent Science Board, from the staff, from the council, people have been incredibly welcoming and helpful in getting up to speed. I can't say I'm fully up to speed, but I'm definitely learning much more. And so thanks for the opportunity and the challenge to talk about my vision for the program. So one thing just to start with is, I would say there isn't need for dramatic change. I think the program is very strong. I was thinking, you always hear at every State of the Union, the president says, the State of the Union is strong, and I've never heard a president say the State of the Union is weak. But in this case, truly, I think the program is very, very strong. And so I'm lucky that I've inherited a program that really is so strong and vital, and that the staff and the science, that Cliff, Dom, and everyone really has brought to such a strong point. So over the last 6 weeks, I've been meeting a number of people, the staff within the program, the staff, the agencies, staff from agencies outside the program, and it's definitely been a whirlwind, but I've learned a lot about the wide range of activities that the program is involved with, And one thing that I found very heartening and enlightening is that there are definitely people outside the agency, outside the science program and the stewardship council, really do value the science program as an honest broker. It's not just talk, and I think we do provide a very important, thoughtful service in terms of providing guidance, reviews, and clarity on science within the Delta. And I also want to say one big reason why I was even interested in applying for the program was speaking with Cliff, speaking with Peter Goodwin about the program, that how much they raved about the staff that we have here in the science program. And as I've been here and met more of the staff, I have to say I'm just incredibly impressed with the wide range of staff and expertise that we have, from Reiner's work, the program managers, all the staff throughout the program. So really dedicated, knowledgeable, and so I feel like it's just a great opportunity to lead a program with such a strong staff. So that said, obviously there always are things to think about moving forward and ways, new things for us to do, or ways to improve things. So the things that I see as really important issues for the science program and for me to help provide more leadership on in terms of new areas is two things to be sure to keep the program really relevant and current. So one important area is to make more of an effort to provide funding for open research programs. So we have a very limited research budget currently, and we fund primarily the fellowship program, which has been very successful. We also fund directed actions that are where we or others identify an issue that's really critical, where there's a need, an immediate need, and we're able to fund those specific programs. But we haven't offered a PSP or an RFP for open solicitation for research since 2010 or 2011. And I feel like clearly there's the need. We've identified many of the current challenges with the Science Action Agenda that the Science Board gave input on and reviewed. And so I think we've highlighted all of those, but now we need to provide some funding and encourage new research in those areas. And as things evolve, as you all know, those critical areas are going to continue to evolve. So I think, in order for us to stay on top of the current issues, we need to do that. And we're making the science program and the Stewardship Council is very aware of this and has always been aware of it. Cliff pushed hard for additional funding over the last few years. And we're making a serious effort now to increase funding for potential research projects. And hopefully that will become available in the near future. Even if we aren't able to increase our funding in that way, I think there are other opportunities where we could collaborate with other agencies to do a joint call for proposals. And so I'm really committed. I think that's something that's really essential for us to be doing. I think one thing also in terms of areas of interest, I think you all know those 5 areas within the Science Action Agenda of human dimensions, the science synthesis, tools and methods for restoration, interactions between stressors and managed species, monitoring, modeling, and data management. One area that I think obviously is really critical, and I know that you've provided input on, is the social science focus, the human dimensions issue. A number of us recently went to the Grand Challenges, a National Academy-sponsored current project to identify grand challenges in environmental engineering, and I think Jessica is going to mention that in her presentation. But one of the take-home messages that all of us got from that meeting was, it was focusing on environmental engineering, but one of the biggest messages was the need to engage social scientists and the need to incorporate social science into environmental engineering. I think the same is obviously true here. So I think that's something we need to really make an effort to reach out and both within the fellowship program and within the PSP program. So that I think is one of my big areas of interest, is to get that funded research continuing on an ongoing basis within the Delta. The second thing I think that's really critical to remain relevant is to put more of a focus and a specific focus on climate change issues. So it's not as though we're not aware or ignoring climate change. It's something that that the science program and the Stewardship Council is very, very much aware of, but it hasn't received a real significant specific focus. And so I think we need to really think more comprehensively about how climate change is going to affect the Delta, how we can incorporate climate change into the management decisions that we're making. Immediately, the opportunity for that is the upcoming amendment to the ecosystem chapter of the Delta Plan that all of you are aware of, and that is just being initiated. And so I think there's really an opportunity within that amendment to highlight how critical climate change is, how it will affect systems, what the restoration opportunities are within climate change. So to me, that's the biggest challenge within the amendment, is to really carefully and articulately identify how we can incorporate climate change into our ongoing planning. And so that's the immediate opportunity. But beyond that, the Delta Science Plan is being updated this coming year, and thinking about how climate change connects in with our adaptive management guidance. We really just need to more comprehensively evaluate and think about how we can incorporate climate change into all of our activities. Related to that, and of course I have a bias, but I think another area where we really need to grow more is into ecosystem restoration. And so I think directly related to the climate change issues is thinking about, as we're going to be embarking on more and more restoration in the Delta, where are we going to do that? How are we going to do that? As I mentioned, one of the critical areas in the Science Action Agenda is identifying more the tools and challenges for restoration. So I think that's something that, again, people are aware of, but I think there's really more and more need to do that in the current, where we are at in terms of current issues within the science program and within the Delta management in general. So again, the ecosystem amendment is a place where we really can highlight those restoration issues. I know you all have mentioned the need for a white paper on ecosystem issues, and I think restoration will probably be a big part of that white paper. So those are two, climate change and restoration, I think, are two areas that I'm really interested in, but I think also are critically relevant for the science program moving forward. Another area that has received a lot of attention already, but we're sort of at a critical point to make some significant progress, is in the use of models within the Delta. And I know the Science Enterprise Workshop really highlighted the roles that models can play. And there's been a significant interest and talk over a number of years in terms of how do we make more progress in terms of using models. So actually we've been initiating a number of meetings with modelers within the Delta community to engage them to see how we can make progress. So, and there's been talk of, the co-laboratory, a physical place for modeling. The science program doesn't have funds to build, to make that happen. But I think what we do have the ability to do is to bring together modelers as we are, to really identify where models can be used effectively in a management context. So I think really that the challenge is looking at what existing models are out there, looking at the current challenges and issues that are of most concern for managers, and identifying where models can really provide some significant insight beyond the current knowledge, and where we can take models if we want to address food web issues and think about what existing models are out there, how can they be integrated in a meaningful way to address really particular management issues. So I think the plan for the the modeling group that's been meeting is to do just that, to identify where we can make some progress in the immediate future, in the next couple of years, where we can demonstrate that further development and integration of models really does provide significant insight, whether that's in restoration prioritization and restoration planning, or in food web issues, or in other areas. I think we'll be working over trying to identify those critical areas. Probably just one or two, because I think what's really most important is convincing the managers that models really are of value and a utility to them. And so we want to be able to show that those integrated models really could provide a significant benefit. So that's a third area that I think is critical. And then the last thing, and something that I've mentioned before and that also is near and dear to my heart, is connecting issues within the Delta up to San Francisco Bay, and really making for a much stronger connection and communication between Delta and Bay issues. And so I think, that again, I don't think there's any magic solution to doing that. And but I think what's really required is a couple of things. First, just facilitating communication. We have our brown bag seminar series here that you all are aware of and I participate in. And what I'd really like to see is a specific effort to reach out to not just scientists, but scientists and policymakers and managers in the Bay, invite them to come up and set up a series of talks around Bay issues so that people here in the Delta can learn what kinds of issues they're working on, what kinds of successes they've had, what kinds of approaches really have worked there that we can learn about. Unfortunately, there isn't a venue in the Bay Area that is a centralized venue like the Brown Bag series here provides within the Delta. But I'm hopeful that we can set up some sort of two-way communication so that not people here from the science program as well as others from the Delta agencies can get to the Bay and communicate to the Bay community what we're working on and what we've learned about. Obviously, the State of the Estuary Conference coming up and the Bay Delta Science Conference here is a great way to communicate, but that only happens once a year, and I think we really need to make a much stronger effort to have ongoing communication and to really direct that communication, as we know here, between scientists and between managers. So I've worked a lot with people at BCDC and the Coastal Conservancy and other agencies, and actually right after the decision was made that I was going to become the lead scientist, I went to a conference, a small local conference down in the South Bay on the salt ponds, and I was talking with people there, and I talked about, those connections. That brought up more interest than anything else. People were so excited about the idea. So there's definitely interest. The bigger challenge, I think the science connection is relatively easy, is the easier one. The policy connection and connecting managers and thinking about regulatory issues is much more challenging. But I think, again, I think there's interest in that. I think similar to the modeling issue, I think we need to think about what are some particular, what's a specific issue that we could identify, whether it's sediment management or nutrient issues, something where there's an obvious connection and where we can make some progress. I mean, the RMP effort already is the regional monitoring program that's been very successful in San Francisco Bay is moving up here. So there already are many growing connections, but I think that's something that really will be useful. And I think, collaborating and connecting, rather than people perceiving the Delta and the Bay as competing for interests for state funds or competing for interest for other issues, we need to present it as a unified estuary that has similar issues, and I think that will raise awareness for both of our challenges and really improve, hopefully, raise awareness, because I think that's another important critical thing is just raising awareness of the issues here, both locally and more broadly. But I think hopefully that would be one thing that would work towards raising that awareness. So then those are some of the issues that I feel are really most critical and that I would really like to make some significant progress on while I'm here as the lead scientist. I think, as I said, and as I started out with, I think, really the strength of the science program is the staff. And so one important sort of internal goal for me is to continue to retain and attract really high-level scientists. And so I think what we need to think about is, within the science program itself, is how do we engage our staff? How do we make best use of our staff? The staff recently came up with a strategic action plan for the science program. And I think we're very much aware of those issues. And I think our challenge is really to help this existing staff to grow professionally, to get opportunities to get recognition for the work that they're doing, and to engage them on the kinds of projects where they really can use their skills and their knowledge most effectively. So a number of staff have indicated, they're really interested to get more involved in some of the syntheses or other issues, other more broad issues that the program is involved with, and so I hope to try to facilitate that in addition to all the additional challenging work that we're doing. So those are the things. So just to summarize, I think the science program is really strong. My job, I feel, is to continue to make the science program the go-to place within the Delta for the direction on science, to being an honest broker on challenging issues within the Delta, providing clear communication and outreach from the science program to policymakers and managers. And so just keeping the ship moving in that direction. And then in terms of new things, pushing for regular solicitation for proposals, engaging on climate change, engaging on restoration, pushing forward on developing the modeling effort, and then expanding connections within the Bay. So those are my thoughts, and I'd love to get your feedback and talk further.
Well, thanks, John. Looks like you're going to be busy.
Yeah.
Any questions from the board members? John?
Yeah, I've got 2 or 3. One of the things that we've been talking about with our future reviews is how to deal with climate change. And there are 2 possibilities. One is to do a review of climate change, and the other is to weave climate change into every one of the other reviews. Okay. How's this? I'm feeling I'm eating the microphone for breakfast. So I wonder what your thoughts are on those 2 options, just sort of off the cuff.
I would say weaving it through is probably, as long as there's really specific incorporation within the issues. To me, it is all-encompassing and
Right.
throughout all of those issues. So, I feel like as you're addressing an issue, specifically thinking about connections to climate change within that issue is really where it would be most helpful and valuable. But that said, of course, I could see a full-blown review on climate change.
Right. Yeah, I think the weaving was sort of the sense of what we had. I just wanted to get your
I think that would be
perspectives on it.
useful, more informative.
Second question, which has to do with staff and staff development. When I was with Nature Conservancy back in D.C. and then with PRBO out here, one of the things that I was charged with was bolstering, in a sense, the scientific self-respect among the staff, who in particular felt that their efforts to do anything that remotely resembled publication were being actively discouraged by the leadership. And I don't think that's the case here, but I wonder whether what your thinking is on trying to put into play something that is more active encouragement of the staff when they have an opportunity to engage in publication and get the authorship recognition that that brings, as well as the recognition for the program. I know some of that goes on, but it struck me from my experience that there are lots of benefits to be gained. The downside, of course, is that it takes time.
Yeah. I'm a strong proponent for that. I feel like that would really raise awareness of the program within the scientific community. You know, I think there is all kinds of great science being done here, and locally everyone is aware of it, but in a broader sense, many people aren't aware of. And so I think where there, you know, it's not to say that it should become the highest priority, but I think where there's opportunities, and not every staff member probably has the interest and the motivation to put in all of that additional effort, but I would strongly encourage it, because I think it will. I think it's useful for the individual staff, and also very, very useful for the program.
Okay, Dick?
I was just going to say, John, I was enjoying what you were saying. I had the mic in the right place, I just didn't have the red button pushed. I was just saying that I was enjoying what you were saying as you were saying it, and then thinking, well, gee, why is this so? And then, oh, well, you're the first person trained in biology we've had since Michael Healy, and that was some time back. So, welcome.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Well, yeah.
Liz?
Yeah. So I was excited to hear about your interest in reinvigorating the science funding through the Delta Science program. So I'm just interested to hear sort of what has to happen to kind of advance that. What do you see as the next steps, and are there ways that the Independent Science Board can assist with that effort?
Well, so, you know, we're actively working to try to raise funding within the state budget, but so we won't know for a while how that will play out. But so I don't know that there's a role for the Independent Science Board immediately, but we'll see, you know, in the coming months how our efforts pan out.
Okay, Joe?
I really like your set of wish list here. Your tall order, but good luck and welcome. One thing I want to ask you about the connection between Delta and the Bay. There's a huge amount of work. You know, if you look at the Journal of Physical Oceanography, it's just something comes up every issue that you're measuring the bed load transport and all those things, which probably didn't get connected to Delta very much before. So this will be a very good opportunity to get those people working there, especially the academics, quite a bit of academics working on this, into this realm. The second one is about the publication. One of the things getting into that arena in an agency is that how to get your merit metrics. You know, you actively encourage to publish. So when you get into your merit review, whether it will be counted towards that or not has been an issue in some of the federal government agencies, how to handle this. So that may be one of the things to think about when you are encouraging, which is a very good thing to do, how to handle that issue. So those are my two comments.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Let me check. Brian, do you have any questions?
None here, but thank you.
Yeah, I had a similar, the connection between the Delta and the Bay is also one of those things, kind of like John's question about the climate, is that we have now listed that as one of sort of the things that we would be looking at in the context of the various reviews we do, because, so I'm wondering, asking the same question, is that something that is topical specific, or so can it be looked at independently, or?
I would do it, think of it as with climate, incorporate it throughout. I mean, so I think we are the Delta Science Program, so I'm not saying we become the the Bay Delta Science Program, but that we be mindful of those connections and really, where possible, encourage collaboration, encourage connection. So I think your role is the Delta Independent Science Board. So I don't think there's the need to do a whole separate issue on that, unless you have lots of extra time to do more reviews.
John does, but the rest of us don't. Any other questions? Well, John, I want to thank you for putting that together for us, and we really look forward to working with you. So,
Mutual. Thank you.
Any public comment on that? Okay, the next item is the report from the council chair, and you're welcome to join us up here. We have name tags and chairs for you. Randy and Jessica.
Good morning. Nice to see you all in person. Just to start off with a quick comment, I understand about that a subset of you met with my staff on the ecosystem amendment and some of the early thinking that we've got there, and I really wanted to say that I appreciate you taking the time to do that. And I think particularly as we approach the amendment with a white paper, as you're suggesting, we may want to reach out at least one more time to make sure that we really understand kind of the best way to incorporate the science in a way that is better connected, as some of the issues that you raised with your review of CSO. And so, once again, I just really appreciate the time that you're willing to put into that on the front end. It's going to help us greatly. I am going to summarize quickly the National Academies event that some of us attended last week, just for your interests. One more thing on the ecosystem amendment, which is that in our August meeting, we had invited the Department of Fish and Wildlife to come and brief us on a product that they're putting together called the Delta Conservation Framework. And I don't know how many of you follow Maven's Notebook, which is kind of a really useful blog of water issues, but there's a great write-up of that presentation on Maven's Notebook, and I'd suggest that you check that out. I believe that the current planning for the council is also to bring back further discussion of our ecosystem amendment at our October meeting, so I'll continue to keep you updated as milestones appear. So last week, Dr. Calloway and I, along with Dr. Reiner Honicke and Jessica Law of my staff, attended the second meeting of a National Academies of Sciences Committee on Grand Challenges and Opportunities in Environmental Engineering and Science for the 21st Century. Their first meeting was held in D.C. back in May, and council representatives, including Randy Fiorini, attended that meeting by phone. The council is actually a co-sponsor of the committee's work, which is a little bit of a different role for us, but was something that Dr. Peter Goodwin felt was an incredibly important opportunity, and I agree. So we're particularly interested in how the future research agenda for the federal government can benefit the Delta and California's water management as a whole. So that's kind of the lens through which we're sitting through these meetings and viewing these discussions. So the committee meeting last week was a mix of open and closed working sessions over 2 days. The open session on Tuesday the 6th, which was held at the California Academy of Sciences, featured several distinguished scientists who spoke on the topics of grand challenges facing food, water, and energy, respectively. The following day, there was a more focused open session on how environmental engineering and science, education, research, and practice can evolve to address sea level rise challenges in the San Francisco Bay Area and beyond. So there were 5 speakers who offered their ideas to the committee that day, and then both in the morning and I believe in the evening, the committee broke into closed session and I think are starting to write. So the next steps for that are that the committee is also going to hold a meeting this fall. I think that may be in Southern California, but I'm waiting for the details on that, at which they'll complete a draft of their report, which will include a high-level list of goals. So these National Academy of Sciences Grand Challenges reports, of which you're probably more familiar than I, but in the past they've been very widely circulated and they're really used as standards for funding educational curriculum and communication. So we're excited to be part of that. It's something a little different for us, but I think it's a really important partnership. Do you want to add anything, John?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is
You're
for this, like I mentioned, I think that one really interesting thing was the strong emphasis on social issues. I think there definitely is more of an opportunity. My perception was it's an engineering effort, environmental engineering effort with a strong focus on infrastructure and those issues. There was some discussion of ecosystems, but I think there could be more of a focus on restoration issues, on resiliency of natural systems, the role of natural systems in addition to designing structures or designing things for resilience. So, but I think it will be really interesting to see what they come up with. And I think there is some opportunity for public input. So, I think it might be, if any of you have some interests, you might want to think about ways that you could provide comments to the panel to push them in particular areas.
And Jessica Law on our staff is really our point person for that, so we'd be happy to put you in contact with the program manager for the effort. Brandy?
I'm off to a good start. I have my microphone on and it works. A couple of things. Last week we hosted a delegation from the High River Valley or region of China, which is, I believe, south and east of Beijing. They have taken a particular interest in the work here at the Stewardship Council thanks to Dr. Peter Goodwin, who's, as you know, has been involved in international science matters and has spent quite a bit of time in China. They translated our Delta Science Plan, the executive summary of the Delta Plan into Chinese, and have used that as a reference in the work that they are doing to develop their water supply considerations, as well as a view towards improving their regional environmental issues. There were 4 members from their delegation and a translator. Our delegation included myself, Jessica Pearson, Jessica Law, who provided an overview of the council's work in the development of the Delta Plan. Dr. John Calloway provided an overview of the Delta Science Program and Science Plan, and Dr. Vince Resch represented you all and described what adaptive management looks like and what we are trying to accomplish here in the Delta. The delegation from China responded with similar reports. It was heartening to recognize that they appreciate the work that we've done and are using that as a goal. And Vince did an excellent job describing adaptive management. It seems like a subject that was a little bit foreign to the delegation. They put most of their effort into fashioning a plan. So their adaptive management is really into adapting a plan. After that, there doesn't seem to be much interest in following through. But I think they recognize that what we're doing is a good thing to do. The next item I have is a thank you to you all for producing the review of the Conveyance, Storage, and Operations Amendment in a timely manner. It's come to us in I think essentially its final form, you have more work to do today, but in its current form, it's going to be utilized by our staff to help influence the CEQA document that is under development before it's released. So thank you for that. One of the comments that was offered to us as a suggestion was the need to create a white paper. And I'm going to need some more information from you all on that. And as Jessica and John mentioned, we would like to incorporate this white paper approach into the next amendment, the Ecosystem and Restoration Amendment. The question I have for you all is, you cited a variety of white papers, one written by me that was very, very science light and very, very policy heavy. And that ranged from that white paper to others that were very, very detailed with a lot of science citations. So after you and our staff have scoped the possible amendment consideration items, I'd really like the opportunity to sit down with you and discuss what you think should be included in a white paper and how sciencey it should be, as I tend to lean heavily on the policy side, but I think maybe what you're asking us to do is a white paper that has a bit of a balance. So with that, unless you have any questions for Jessica or me, I think we're finished.
Okay, thanks, Randy and Jessica. Any discussion? Brian?
Oh, thank you, but no.
Okay, any public comment? Okay, let's move on to the next item, and that is an action item, which is to deal with the approval of our current documents on conveyance, storage, and operations. Just as a background, we were asked to review the, I think it's the June 22nd draft amendments, and during our last meeting, we divided our review into three components. One is an actual review, and the other two are memos, and also gave a content approval of what was in those three documents. And between then and now, we spent some time doing some editing to clarify what we're saying, but did not change any of the content. And so what you have now is the final drafts of those three documents. And the action item we're looking, I guess we need to have a motion and a second to move forward and approve those first, and then we can have
I move they be approved.
Okay, is there a second to that? Vince?
Second.
And Dick. Any further discussion on those documents? Brian?
No, I'm happy with it. Thank you.
Okay, any public comment? Well, yes. I'm asking Brian, in case you've noticed, I'm asking Brian because we decided some people, when we have individuals on a teleconference, they often get ignored. So this way it gives them, they can't raise their hand very easily. So not that I expect Brian
You're
to.
just trying to make sure I'm here. I was eating a plum when you asked that.
Well, you have to take your mute off and get your hands off your emails, I guess, to respond. Okay, I guess we can just go for a vote. All those in favor say aye. Aye. And are any opposed? No. So now you have your final documents. And
Again, thank you very much. We really appreciate the effort that you put into this, and wish you great success the remainder of today and with the tour tomorrow. Thank you.
okay, so I guess we'll just move forward and put those on letterhead and get those out, and that'll be an action item. Looking at Edmund. Okay. We are ahead of schedule, and then our agenda says we'll take a 10-minute break if we're ahead of schedule. So should we go ahead and do that? We're probably going to end up being earlier for lunch. I don't know if we want to think about if we can move agenda items up or not. Well, for now, let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll think about possibly moving something up if we get there in time. I'd like to reconvene. We're going to be moving to item 6, but just to give you a heads up, if we're probably going to finish that before lunch, so we've moved item number 8 we'll take on after that, which is the discussion of the monitoring enterprise. So with the one-page summary, Tricia, are you starting?
Yeah, I'll start. So you should all have with your set of papers this one-pager, or it's really one page on 2 sides, on adaptive management. So it's adaptive management pertaining to ecosystems. And I worked internally with some staff. So I worked with Nir Oxenberg and Heidi Williams here at the science program. And then I also took a lot of advice from Joy Zedler and John Weens. So thank you very much for your thoughts and comments to get this to where it is today. So what we have here is an information item that could be used to communicate adaptive management to various groups. It's sort of a high-level points of the adaptive management review that the ISB completed. So I think originally the audience was sort of high-level decision makers and policymakers, but I think that where it is now, the audience could be pretty broad. The content is accessible to a lot of different levels of people who work in adaptive management or who would need to know more about adaptive management. So this is not the final version. Hopefully it'll be much prettier. It'll have a lot more design on it at some point. But I wanted to present it today to get any feedback on the content of what's here. So there's adaptive management description, and then also how it differs from other management scenarios, potentially called traditional management, and then kind of what the community who would be using adaptive management would need to support to make sure that it is incorporated into managing practices. And on the back, we have sort of some success stories of adaptive management. So I wanted to bring this to you and see if anyone had comments or otherwise wanted to change the content.
And remember, we've decided that this is one of the mechanisms we're going to be using to kind of distribute our results. And the discussion was to start with the adaptive management 2-pager to kind of see how that goes and see what the content is. And we also want to discuss who the audience might be, how we might distribute it, how we might get the words out, what we're going to use this for. We also discussed if once we have one sort of done and the model working, is that we would develop these for each of our major reviews that we've done, and realizing that they might have different audiences and they might have different purposes for some of those, just given the different nature of the reviews. So I guess we can talk first about what this particular 2-pager, and then see if there's any further input on the broader ways forward. Joy.
Up there. As I was mentioning to Tricia earlier, it seems to me we don't want to pigeonhole traditional management and adaptive management into discrete, identifiable subsets of management, but rather to have blurry lines or a spectrum from one to the other. And so I think these boxes will disappear in the next version. And I think my question is, since I usually cut words and John and I kind of go back and forth on which words, and does this have too many words, and does it have the right words to make the point for the audience we intend? And I'm always for fewer words, but then it becomes kind of terse and rough.
You're implying that I'm more on words.
Moi?
Yes.
I tried to dance around that.
Darcy, are you?
I just wanted to point out, Tricia's looking for information, your feedback on content. And you'll notice there was a previous version that we had a really nice design, but we wanted to make some changes to it. So just rest assured that there will be a little bit more design focus once the finished product is ready. But just so maybe don't comment so much on the design, but more on the content.
Yeah, along those lines, we can give you some comments now, but I presume you're asking for, we could all send you individual comments as well.
Yeah, certainly, because I don't assume everyone has already seen this and is able to do wordsmithing at this point. But yeah, if you can take a look at it, and I'll provide a digital version as well for everyone to take a look at.
And another question, to resolve the conflict that Joy and John have about how many words, there's also, wasn't this going to be passed through sort of a communications expert who would then, has that gone through that, or will it go through that?
Well, Neer and Heidi are in the science program, but they work closely with the council communication staff. So there will be a little bit more review, and that was part of the design issues that we had that were late yesterday, and so we couldn't make those changes in time. But yes, there will be a little bit more of a layer of review from the council communication staff.
Okay, we've got a bunch of people. Start with Liz, then Joe and Tracy.
These are just some, quick feedback things. So I do think it's a nice idea to think about management along a continuum. So rather than just having these two discrete traditional or adaptive management, to be able to represent that spectrum of management approaches. And I don't really have an idea for how to do that, but I embrace that concept. And then so I did want to ask, for this particular document, who is the intended audience? Because I think that will inform our suggestions for how to modify the document, if we know, at least in this case, who the target audience would be.
So we bounced around some ideas also. I think where this stands right now is it is broad enough to go in a couple of different ways, because I started with the idea of it being decision makers, but then I think it came down more to a level of potentially managers or people who would be using it who know the word adaptive management but may not actually be implementing or want to know like a little bit more. It's not detailed enough to, obviously it's not detailed enough to provide specifics on adaptive management, which is why on the back it links you to the original review that the ISB did and then also the journal article that just came out. So yeah, I would say it's less towards like scientific technical audience, but more maybe it's a high level understanding. So I would say managers and maybe even general public, although it might be a little technical for the general public, but then also in between kind of high level decision makers and policymakers in there.
I think as we were working on this, the audience sort of evolved in our minds. And the way I think of it is we've got the words floating around in all sorts of venues now. It's part of a legal mandate from the legislature, which implies somehow that the legislators knew what they were talking about. We'll take that at face value. But I think that there's widespread interest in this, and therefore I think that there ought to be a widespread audience for whatever we put out. We did a review of it. The review was intended to be useful, and it ought to be useful to anyone who's wondering about what all this adaptive management stuff is about.
Joe?
When I look at this one, I mean, it's just traditional management. Design of the project is their plan. So there is a plan for these people when they design, any engineering or I don't know, ecological project. So the only difference here is that the goals may or may not be met. You have a feedback loop from that, saying that you evaluate, and then you refine, and then it goes back to implementation. So that feedback loop is the only one which is provided by the adaptive management. So it's a traditional one modified through evaluation and refinement.
Okay.
So you can have only one diagram, but with feedback loop. I mean, this is just a suggestion.
Okay, I see what you're
Yeah.
saying.
And I'll just say that, number one, I think this is great. This is what we wanted to do. This is a great draft of it. I'll echo what everybody else said. I think the emphasis of our adaptive management review was that we were focusing on what do you mean by active adaptive management, by specifically having the feedback, specifically having your goals, specifically looking for the evaluation, because almost all management is adaptive to some extent. If you fail, you get fired, and then the company adapted and hired somebody else. So it's just a question of what we're talking about is mindful adaptive management. But again, I think that we all will. I've just got this. I'm looking forward to going through it and then giving you hopefully good constructive feedback. So
Okay.
thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Vince?
Well, I think this is great as almost like an advertising flyer that could be given to anybody. I wish we had it because the delegation from China was very, very interested in this and would have been a wonderful handout to give. If you're going to do any kind of comparison, it's always good if you can have the same terms in both as opposed to completely different terms.
Okay.
And also, I have to admit, I don't really see these two examples really illustrating what adaptive management, the process of, because it doesn't follow through on them. It just says, well, it could do this, and now they're studying this. If you could, even a hypothetical example, I think would be better than ones that may leave the people that read this more confused than not. And I agree with Joy. I think far less words is better than more. Don't worry about sentences, bullet points, and things like that are key.
Okay.
Yeah,
But I agree with you a lot, too.
One comment I would have is maybe turn it more positive. I see the word is not or was not at least 6 or 7 times in the document, and even when you talk about adaptive management in that paragraph below the box. And so I would think about it in terms, again, the messaging of who the audience is and what you're trying to convince them of, and I think it's adaptive management is legally required, is a valuable technique, it needs more emphasis and money and stuff, and some sort of a positive take on it. That's just a general suggestion. Brian, do you have any thoughts?
But thank you, no.
Okay, so it sounds like these things are going to take some time because you're going to get, I'm sorry, Dick.
And so I'm just going to pick up on Tracy's mindful comment, and maybe we could just start with a mindset comment that if you have the mindset that nature is going to be fickle, that it isn't going to behave the way you expect it, or you do not have expectations as to how it will behave, she will behave, then you go into the process differently, and you're mindful of how it's behaved, she is behaving, and you are prepared to respond with multiple alternatives. And whereas if you go into the process with a fixed mindset, that's more traditional. And that may be a narrow mind versus an open mind. That's not maybe as constructive as you want to be, but that would be a way of putting a mindset into it.
Yes, John.
I think one audience to be aware of is the council. So I think the council's very interested in what the science board does. And if you, just as you mentioned, Vince, thinking of it as an advertisement to lure them into reading more of what you're doing is very useful. So think of them as policymakers, but I would specifically think about the council as an audience.
Okay.
And in terms of connecting them up to your other products, I would try to differentiate the two links of the journal article and the report of why someone would, what's in the journal article or what's in the report, so you would direct them towards one or the other, or they would at least have an idea of why they would want to try either of those as a link. And then just a detail although most people will see it as an electronic document, if it's printed, they won't have that. So somewhere have a printed link at the bottom or something, at least for the reports.
Right.
So is there a deadline you want to receive further comments by? 10 o'clock this morning? Or what,
Yeah, maybe we could have, I'll circulate it, and then if it could come back to me within 2 weeks, if that's possible.
Maybe could you circulate with some of the changes that have been discussed
Okay.
rather than this
Yes.
one? That would be
That
better, yeah.
Yeah, I can make that happen. And then we can discuss it again at the next, or you guys can maybe finalize it before the next meeting.
Yeah, and Joy and I will be happy to continue to work on this and find a compromise in terms of our wordiness.
So are we in a position to talk about, I know we have listed what might be the next one or that we might want to work on, or audiences, or the process itself?
Well, I think taking the first report we did on restoration would be a really easy one to do.
Tracy?
And I think the current chair should work with them on efficient flows. I mean, I think efficient flows is one that, restoration, I agree we should be complete. But the efficient flows is one where I think a treatment like this would really help people.
I'm happy to do that. Are you happy to do that? Let's start another one right away, or?
We can finish this one first, and then let's then talk about the next one.
Yeah,
Shall
I
I
can
go?
put together a very, very rough draft. I've done some of these before. Liz?
Well, not to burden Tricia at all, but I'm wondering if this should just become a standard operating practice, that when we do a full review, that we also have a product like this that accompanies or complements the review.
I'm seeing a lot of head nodding. I think that's kind of that's a good idea to maybe formalize it, because that's what came out of a lot of the panel comments, that we should be doing something like this. And I think we kind of agreed to that a few years ago, too.
Yeah, I think that was what we agreed to as well. Just remember, Tricia won't be here. There will be a new fellow, and so we can continue this. And I think that is what we've all agreed to.
Okay, well, I'm certainly happy to start with the fish and flows one, and if someone wants to do an initial thought about the restoration one before that, or Delta's place. So I think the way we can decide which one goes next is which one gets the first draft done first and moves it through the process. And okay, any other thoughts on this topic? Any public comment? Okay, so we're going to move ahead to talk about the monitoring review. It's item number 8 on the agenda, and Vince has the lead on that.
Well, thanks, Steve. We met this morning, and we've been Reiner and I have been in communication in terms of how the project is advancing through the science program. Basically, the main things that we move forward on is that we have 3 different categories of following this idea of having a brown bag seminar. The first will be people that will be invited for traditional brown bag seminars. They're local people. They really are dealing with monitoring issues in the Delta. And they will take place in the traditional venue we have for those. And of course, they're webcast, so the members of the Science Board can keep up to date with them. We then have a second group that are people that are in California dealing with monitoring issues, ranging from squirp in Southern California to some academic people working on salmon. And we're holding that in abeyance now, seeing how that first series of brown bag seminars go, in terms of either inviting them to continue that process or perhaps having a one-day workshop. And then we have a third group, which are people that have worked on monitoring and a variety of issues. That these are basically from the Science Enterprise workshop that was held that was very successful. And so we have a series of names for that. So it's kind of a sequential process that we're going to do in terms of seeing which how far we want to pursue this. As Tracy pointed out this morning, we've asked for contributions. We've got about 20 names so far, and a lot more that could come that are in the hopper. So I think we want to see how this works in terms of making this most efficient. In terms of the RFP, we're hoping to get a draft perhaps next week or hopefully by the end of the month, depending on vacations and things like that we can review for going out. There'll be a 60-day review period. There have been several good suggestions brought up about how the draft should be less prescriptive, but prescriptive enough that we make sure that we know what we're covering what we want in the proposal. So that's.
Vince, I wanted to clarify one thing. You said a 60-day review period. Did you mean a 60-day response period?
Response period,
okay,
yeah. That's what I meant. Yeah, 60-day response, yes. The subcommittee has come up with some preliminary ways of reviewing the proposals, and these will also involve interviews with the leading contenders. We did look at the Delta RMP reviews, and I spoke to the chair of that committee in terms of how we can basically learn from their lessons in terms of how they did their reviews. And basically, I think the idea we came up with, both from their recommendations and we agreed on this morning, was that we'll really try to come up with a framework or a conceptual model of what we hope this review will give us, and then from that go to the design of actually how we'll look at not just what the consultant is doing, but how we'll go about our individual tasks. So that was something that they found would have been very, very helpful in their process. And finally, I want to just mention the IEP, which has been a topic of potential review for 7 years since this committee was formed. Liz and I have kind of looked at possibilities of how to do that without duplicating the efforts in the monitoring review and the monitoring enterprise review. And we have come up with some suggestions this morning about how we could, in tandem and perhaps using a non-monitoring view of the IEP as a way of helping us facilitate the actual monitoring review. So there was, a lot of discussion this morning. There's a lot of issues, one of which is, do we have time to do this given all the other thematic reviews we're thinking of doing, and we'll discuss that this afternoon. Can we, in fact, make this separate from an IEP monitoring review, given that 80% of what IEP does is basically monitoring? But at the same time, it's clear from talking with people at IEP that they feel that there's many, many topics that could be reviewed and would be very, very helpful for them. But as I said, we'll get back to that this afternoon.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else from that group want to add to that, or any discussion? Tracy?
So one thing that I think we're still not having, and we'll talk about it when we provide comments. I'm still not seeing a list of evaluation criteria by which we're going to evaluate the different proposals. And we have a process, we're sort of saying, here's how we're gonna do the process, and you've talked about that some, but I think before we, and just as a caution to us, before we even get a draft of the RFP out there, we've gotta have the evaluation criteria. And I understand it's a dance between being prescriptive, but still, if anytime you send out a proposal, a request for proposals, you've gotta say how you're gonna evaluate them, so.
Yeah. We did have a list of questions that we drew up that was very, very preliminary. I don't think it even got circulated beyond a couple of people to do that. But again, not having seen how the final RFP is going to be worded, but I agree with you completely that is something we'll do. And once we get the RFP, I'll take that as a chance to do a first draft of that.
As a draft, we'll get a draft of the RFP, but, I mean, the evaluation criteria are an integral part of the RFP.
Right. But as I say, I don't think we can do that until we actually see what the RFP is, which way it's going. But we do have some preliminary questions that we had come up with.
Darcy?
Yeah, we did have some evaluation criteria that were included, and they were drafts, so you will get to see those. I haven't seen them recently myself, but yes, you will get to see those.
Yes, I would presume they would be part of the RFP, right?
Yes.
They have to be, yeah. Liz? Brian?
Again, no thank you, Steve.
Any other thoughts about the monitoring review discussion? Whether or not an IEP is done in tandem, and that we could probably discuss a little bit without necessarily fully committing, just the topic of whether it should be done at all separately, and that. This afternoon we're going to talk about all of the various ideas we have for thematic reviews and think about which ones are important to do, and then secondarily think about which ones we have time to do, and what might be the who might take the lead and what might be the time frame when we might start some of these. Some may be starting after we finish other reviews, but I think now we still have some time to talk about just the IEP review itself and whether or not that's a valuable thing to do and how it relates to monitoring. Vince?
What I would say is that I think an IEP review would be quite different from any of the other reviews we've done. We're basically dealing with an agency that has very, very broad issues, and also, as we heard this morning, there's a lot of things that we know we could do for make recommendations on, just in terms of talking with people that are involved in IEP, such as funding models and things like that. I think that simply doing any kind of review of IEP is going to get us thinking more about the monitoring review, because we're constantly going to come up with monitoring questions. And as I tried to tell Steve, I don't have any personal push in this. It's just that Liz and I have been talking back and forth, that we've talked about this for such a long time. We didn't want to see it get lost as a topic for review.
Yes, John?
I was just going to mention, yesterday was the IEP directors meeting, and at that meeting I let them know about this, not about a potential review of IEP, but a review of the monitoring enterprise, and they were very interested and also specifically interested in the brown bag seminars. So I think when we get that available, we'll be sure to distribute that to all of the IEP members so that they can participate.
John?
I think these two reviews, the monitoring and an IEP non-monitoring activities structure review, complement one another very nicely. And I think, given the fact that IEP has been sort of waiting for our words one way or another, that this is an obvious opportunity to provide them with something that they're primed to be able to use and embrace. I think we should not let that opportunity go by, and I think doing a non-monitoring review concurrently with the monitoring review would really help each reinforce the others. So I would argue pretty strongly that we need to do both, and we need to do them in tandem.
Okay, Liz?
Yeah, I agree. I think that, I guess I see the IEP review as being about more than monitoring, although obviously there is a place where it overlaps with monitoring. But, you know, the IEP just plays such a central role in, you know, acquiring information about the Delta. It has had like a long time history of providing information. And I guess I do think that there is an area of overlap, but I too would like to see a focus on that and see the two as being complementary rather than being redundant to one another.
Yeah, the more I think about this, I'm tending to agree, because in some sense, if you ask general questions like how well are they coordinated, how well are the data shared, how well are they synthesized, what's going on, you could ask those, you know, in the context of the monitoring or in the context of non-monitoring. And I guess, so it almost certainly within the monitoring context, that question would be asked. And so it might as well be asked for the non-monitoring as well, because I presume the answer is going to be very much the same. Tracy?
And I just for the sake of sort of semantics, I think we're referring to this as a programmatic review of IEP, sort of the business model, how it's structured, how things fit, how processes are going. And so if we talk about a programmatic review of IEP, concurrent with the monitoring enterprise review, which will include a lot of IEP and how it's fitting into the big monitoring picture in the Delta. But I think what we're saying is we are planning, it sounds like we're planning or agreeing, that we will try to do a programmatic review of IEP in a fairly short order. I mean, we'll try to get to that pretty quickly.
Is it worth having a small work group, and I know that some thought has already been given to this, to just scope out what that might be in terms of what are the key topics that would be looked at, and then do it in the context of thinking about the monitoring being done elsewhere, and just using your words basically, and say from a programmatic review, what sort of specific things would be looked at that would not be looked at, let's say, in a monitoring.
I mean, I think Vince and I tried to initiate some of that, but we could refine it further. And Tracy, that is very helpful to me, to be able to separate a programmatic review from a thematic review. And, you know, to see that there are places of overlap and complementarity, but they are distinct from one another.
And the reason I said that is because we have been, I mean, if you read our original charter, everything looks like a programmatic review. We're supposed to review programs and say how these programs should be, you know, addressed, modified, you know, triple their funding, whatever it is we're going to recommend. And we've consciously said we're going to do thematic reviews. But in the case of the IEP, we've been requested fairly consistently to do what's basically a programmatic review. And I think what I'd just like us to say specifically, in this case, we are going to go back to our original charge and do basically a programmatic review of this one program that we've had a regional request to do that for quite some time. And now with Steve Culbertson being there for, you know, half a year or more, they've gone through their previous review of their business model. They've made changes, and I think this is a good time to do that. So.
I'd suggest that maybe Liz, Tracy, and I, since we've learned to work together on the water quality review, that maybe we draft something about how we would do it, with a goal that we do complete it shorter than the water review timetable.
That should be the goal of all of our reviews, shouldn't it?
But it would be good. We work together well, so I think we could do it fairly easily. Or John, do you want to leave the room for a moment?
It seems to me one of the questions we should be asking is IEP an example of other possible coordinations between agencies? You know, could there be comparable things for water management, levee management, and so I don't know quite what those other things would be. I mean, it's obvious for IEP, but maybe there are others.
So you're thinking of putting this together, I guess the question is, so therefore are we committing to do an IEP review? Are we committing to have investigate it further by seeing what it would really entail before we jump into it, or?
I think we should put this in the context of the other reviews we're considering this afternoon and bring it up again and decide then.
Okay, see heads nodding, so does that mean you'll have it scoped out by the?
Yeah, Tracy will have it ready for us.
Okay, any further thoughts or discussion on that, either the monitoring or the IEP review? And we will take that up and just, once we decide this afternoon of what are our priority areas, see how much time we have, which ones rise to the surface after that. Okay, not seeing any public comment on this? Well, we're still ahead. I don't know if there's anything, is there anything, I'm looking at Darcy and Edmund, that's near the end of our agenda that logistics-wise? Well, let me say one thing. I believe there's a discussion underway to postpone the start of tomorrow's field trip until 8 o'clock, given that people's plane flights have changed and no one needs to depart early. Edmund?
Yeah, so I emailed Steve Chappelle, one of the field leads, during our break time, and I had to call him during our lunch period to discuss things further. So stay tuned on that.
Okay, so heads up, and for those who are listening in and thinking of attending the field work, if you show up at 7 o'clock, I guess you'll send out a notice, or?
We'll try to, but there's a lot of things to consider when delaying a public field tour.
Okay. Liz, did you have something?
Well, I was just going to say that, I think we want to, it would be nice to have the flexibility to begin later, but we also should be respectful of the fact that a lot of people have sort of scheduled around our original start time. So maybe you can let us know how they respond to the request for a change in schedule.
Yeah, I'll definitely do that.
Yeah, I don't think we don't have a more detailed schedule other than start time and place.
Yeah, so we'll flesh out more details in the afternoon when Cliff Feldheim presents his presentation on the Suisun Marsh.
And can Cliff start at 1 rather than 1:10 today?
I told him to be here around 1, so if he's here, I think we can start early.
Okay. Darcy?
I was just looking at the rest of the agenda. I don't see anything that we could fit in 14 minutes, unless you wanted to start some of the discussion on upcoming reviews, but it might be nicer to keep that all together.
Okay, I guess we could discuss the WebEx issue.
Yeah.
And the question is, we want to continue trying to use WebEx for our teleconferences, or is it more trouble than it's worth? Joy?
Your discussion, but I have participated in other WebEx interactions, and I think they're wonderful. And for my hearing difficulties, especially because I can listen to the computer rather than the telephone, and the possibility of having comments alongside the right-hand side of the screen is really useful, and most importantly, you can find out who's speaking and keep track much better of the conversation.
Yes, we tried it experimentally, and it seemed to work once we all got on. Liz?
Yeah, I guess I haven't heard any reasons not to think about using WebEx, and I only see a lot of potential benefits. You know, we, both in terms of organization of the meeting. So for example, it's very difficult in a teleconference to know when to jump in and when not to. It also allows the chair or whoever is moderating the meeting to know who has something to say. It allows the possibility for informal comment that, you know, maybe doesn't have to be verbal, but, you know, just small points of clarification as the meeting is going on. And, you know, it also allows us to look at content. So, you know, like, for example, we might want to think about using it just for our regular meetings as well when people are calling in. You know, if we have presentations, people can be following along. Knowing who's speaking is really important. If any of you have been on telephone calls, it's not only difficult to follow the members of the Delta ISB and who is speaking, but if we have any guests, usually those names are very fast and garbled, and sometimes it's very easy not to catch them. So I would be a big advocate for encouraging us to at least continue the experiment and perhaps think about ways we can expand its use.
Okay, and on the regular meetings, of course, we have the live video, and I'm sure Brian is watching us as he's calling in. Okay, let's break for lunch. I need to announce that we do have we will be going into a closed session for lunch to discuss a personnel issue, and then we'll reconvene at 1 o'clock. Okay, I'd like to reconvene. Welcome back to the Independent Science Board meeting. And I'd like to introduce and thank Cliff Feldheim, who's the chief of the Suisun Marsh branch from the California Department of Water Resources, who will be telling us about the marsh and really giving us a sort of an introduction to tomorrow's full-day field trip, where we'll be there, and which is one of the purposes of the field trip is to help inform our monitoring review, because certainly a lot of the monitoring discussion will be about the Suisun Marsh. So, Cliff, I want to really thank you for coming here today and informing us. So.
There we go. How about that? A little bit better? Right? Maybe? Yeah, you can hear me anyways. Can't really hear myself with it. Very good. Yeah, thank you. So, I run our Suisun Marsh branch, DWR. I've been in the position about 4 years now, and I've been with DWR about 10 years. Prior to that, worked for a variety of nonprofits as well as California Fish and Game. I've been doing this type of work. First started working in the marsh. Let's see, I banded my first duck in the marsh in '91. So, been working with waterfowl in the marsh a good long time and seen lots of changes. So, when I was able to come to the position to really impact the conservation of the marsh, it's something that means something to me and something that I enjoy passing on to my kids, getting them out there. So, thank you for the opportunity to share. I'm going to briefly go through the monitoring that we're doing in the marsh, from the compliance monitoring to the research, and then I'll wrap it up with a brief overview of a couple of the restoration projects that we'll see tomorrow. And please, I'd like to make this as informal as possible. Interrupt me at any time, ask questions at any time. And with that, I'll start with a little bit of background and regulatory history of the marsh. Yep. There we go. So the marsh itself, the legal boundary is about 120,000 acres in size, with about 52,000 acres of managed wetlands, which is duck hunting clubs largely. Also managed wetlands on the state wildlife areas. 30,000 acres of bays and sloughs. Hunting in the marsh, duck hunting, has a long history dating back to the first clubs in 1879. And currently, there's about 158 duck hunting clubs in the marsh. And really the marsh, as you may well be aware, is there today because of those duck hunting clubs and because of that long history. You can kind of see in this picture, this is the edge of the marsh and Suisun City / Fairfield. And there's actually a housing development right on the edge there that advertises homes with Suisun Marsh views. And they're built right up to the legal boundary. And without that really, honestly, wealthy duck hunters who had political influence during the time, pushing back on those cities, the whole thing would have been developed. So long history and some people in the marsh that are fiercely protective and proud of that history. So interesting group of folks to work with. And the marsh is critical habitat for a diversity of waterfowl species. It's a transition zone between the San Francisco Bay estuary and the Delta, that mixing zone, if you will. And the marsh and bay together support up to 75% of the Pacific Flyway population of canvasback, scaup, and ruddy ducks. So a significant portion of the flyway's species are there. And statewide, up to 75% of the state's wintering redheads use the estuary and marsh together. So critical habitat for those species. And then it's adjacent to the Central Valley, and the Central Valley being one of the most important wintering waterfowl areas in North America. It's really, well, we include it as part of the Central Valley Habitat Joint Venture, which is an implementing arm of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. The Suisun Marsh is considered part of the Central Valley Joint Venture. So that connection and that reliance on both those habitats is clear. So very important for waterfowl. And so much so that in 1974, the state legislature passed the Suisun Marsh Preservation Act, which actually put in the statute that we needed the state's mandate to maintain wintering waterfowl carrying capacity in the Suisun Marsh. And that was presumably by providing high-quality foods for wintering waterfowl. And that's a unique distinction in North America. There's no other wintering waterfowl area in the country that has a state law requiring us to maintain wintering waterfowl populations. So very unique. And if we set the political climate and the regulatory climate at that period, 70s and early 80s, there really wasn't any of our environmental regulations that we have today. State and federal Endangered Species Acts were in their infancy. There was a handful of listed species at best. There wasn't CEQA. There wasn't any of these other things. And what there was a very strong waterfowl lobby. Picture here is of Dan Chapin from California Waterfowl. Some of you might know Dan. I know someone here in the audience knows Dan, knew Dan, worked with him. A great force for the conservation of waterfowl and wetlands in the state during his time as a lobbyist for CWA. And really, it was because of that influence that waterfowl have the importance that they do in the marsh and have the regulatory tie. Shortly after, in the early 80s, as impacts from water diversions from the state and federal water project became more noticeable, if you will, to people, those impacts in the marsh, the estuary being increased salinity. As those things got highlighted, the impacts got called out, the major critter that needed to be mitigated for was waterfowl. And in 1984, the Suisun Marsh Preservation Agreement was established, was signed, and established water quality standards, basically salinity standards in the marsh, based on the foraging needs of waterfowl. And it mandated actions by the Bureau and DWR to create different facilities to provide better quality water to duck hunting clubs in the marsh and to fish and game lands. So really mitigating, mitigating for waterfowl, which is something that you just don't see elsewhere, and that's why I highlight it, setting that stage. And, I'll get into a little bit. We also have, in a lot of these agreements, the nebulous do good things for native wildlife. And I've wrestled with that. And I'll highlight how I've dealt with some of those things. So the state water project facilities that were established as a result of the Suisun Marsh Preservation Agreement include the Roaring River Distribution System, which provides 8,000 water for 8,000 acres of managed wetlands. The Morrow Island Distribution System, which is about 1,800 acres of managed wetlands. Goodyear Slough, which is 1,200. And then a little while, about 10 years later, the salinity control gates, which we'll visit tomorrow, which impacts approximately 50,000 acres of bay and slough water that's used for flood up of duck hunting clubs. So really impacting, again, we're charged with maintaining wintering waterfowl populations and providing high quality habitat for waterfowl on private land, which is an interesting mitigation requirement. We really don't have control over what private landowners do, so how do we achieve those things? And something that we wrestle with. And with the establishment of those facilities, we began to do a number of different compliance monitoring activities. So I'll highlight here the 4 main activities we've been doing, in some cases for 30 plus years as a result of the creation of these facilities. The salt marsh harvest mouse fish, plant communities, and then finally the water quality monitoring. So again, we started trapping salt marsh harvest mice over 30 years ago in the Suisun Marsh. The methods are highlighted here on the slide. I won't dive into those. You can see the sites are highlighted in blue there. We trap every 3 years, and the compliance goal is a capture efficiency rate, which one could argue doesn't have a lot of biological relevance. And so we've tried to take it a step further, working with graduate students at UC Davis to look at things like food habits, look at their travels, habitat use. Actually, a result of some of that work, in 2013, a paper published in the Journal of Wildlife Management with Fish and Game staff and DWR staff really highlighted for the first time habitat use for salt marsh harvest mice outside of tidal environments. Prior to that, they were seen as a tidal species using pickleweed in that zone. And really what we've been able to show by expanding trapping is that their highest density, highest numbers are actually in duck hunting clubs in managed wetlands. And then through work with UC Davis graduate students, through food habit trials, they appear to be eating many of the same seeds and plants that we think are important for waterfowl. So duck hunting clubs are growing plants and seeds that are potentially valuable to salt marsh harvest mouse as well. So that paper really is a paradigm shift in how we see salt marsh harvest mouse habitat across the landscape, and really emphasized to us the need to work with private landowners to promote salt marsh harvest mice. And we've been doing a lot of that work. And in general, landowners are very receptive, as long as it doesn't impact their ability to manage land. And that's what some of our current research is focusing on.
Is there a current effort to delist the salt marsh harvest mouse?
We have had those discussions. Basically, we've been told by the service that we need to do a genetic study, and we've done the trapping throughout the range of the salt marsh harvest mice. UC Davis Genetics Lab is actually crunching that data right now. With the idea, is the Suisun Marsh have a unique subspecies? If so, then it could qualify for at least a downgrade or a delisting. But we believe, and the folks that have worked with the mouse for decades out there believe that the population is stable to increasing. And it's very different than the bay population, which is in deep trouble. And largely because of the managed wetland habitat. And really, I say one of our goals is to take it a step further now and say, what are those management actions where we can provide valuable habitat on the ground? We know they will use lots of different habitats, but how do we maintain populations through management actions? So we're going down that road. Another really long data set, 30 plus years, is a fish sampling data set, monthly surveys that have been done by Peter Moyle's lab, I think for 36 years now. And those sites here are highlighted on the map, really looking at the major inlets into the bays in the marsh and doing trawls and seines, documenting fish communities and some of those changes. And I've been working with Peter. We hope to have a postdoc on here in the coming year to summarize that 30-year data set and really start to dive into it. What are those trends in specific species and assemblages? And something like clams, where have the clams spread to and not in the marsh? The marsh has a lot fewer clams and better habitat. How does that impact native fish communities? Again, trying to take one of the roles I saw when I took over the program was taking our compliance monitoring the next step and really learning from it. Not just checking a box in the permit box and sending our annual report, but using it so that we could have better information to manage habitat. So we're getting there, and more information to come on that. And a final biological data set, we got charged with managing plant communities, monitoring plant communities, excuse me, in the marsh as a means of tracking changes to salt marsh harvest mouse habitat. So every 3 years, aerial surveys are flown throughout the marsh, and general plant communities are characterized and trends evaluated. So this example in the bottom right, you can see the red. That's the changes in one parcel in Phragmites abundance. Phragmites, the non-native invasive type in the marsh, from 1999 on the left to 2012 on the right. And so in this example, you can kind of see it gives you an idea of tracking vegetative communities. If we got down on the ground, there's probably 4 to 6 species plants out there in that community. It doesn't give you that level of detail, but it gives you those large-scale changes. And again, we're looking at this data set now. It was originally set up to track changes really in pickleweed habitat, because that was thought of in the 80s as being necessary for salt marsh harvest mice. We now know that other habitat communities might be even more important. So using it as a means to track large changes. And again, trying to use it as something other than checking our compliance box, but making the data useful. And finally, the other large data set we have is our water quality stations in the marsh. And we have 18 different stations. They're in yellow, and there's boxes and stars, 3 different types of stations really. But the goal is really to monitor salinity. And we've expanded some of them here and there. We're going to start looking, we're talking with the Regional Water Quality Control Board about dissolved oxygen, some other sondes on these to make them more useful, if you will, and get more information. But since they're compliance monitoring stations, we're charged with monitoring salinity. If salinity changes to certain levels in the marsh, we have actions that we have to do with the salinity control gates. We need to compensate landowners for increased salinity and water that be delivered to their duck club. So very much focused around those compliance actions, again, as opposed to biological relevance. And one of the things I've got a couple of my staff working on, trying to take this long-term data set and say in the face of climate change and increased salinity coming to the marsh, is there a way that we can take this 30-year data set and model it such that we know what are the normal ranges of salinity that we'd expect in any given month and associate probabilities with that so that you have, we get a high salinity reading. Well, how confident are we that that falls within our natural range of variation, or that's something we haven't seen before? And if that trend continues, is it an indicator of real change in the system, or is it, something that we monitor and not necessarily be alarmed with? So trying to frame that up in a more meaningful management action-oriented approach. We have such a long data set. And the salinity during the drought, 7-year drought that we had, in some places got very high. And so it's going to be interesting, as I say, to frame those up with probabilities, confidence intervals around them. And do we start to see those extreme drought salinities during times that aren't drought? And those are red flags. And then how does that change our management actions and so forth? And then the next step, which I'm hoping to take, is then how does that change the biological communities and the plant communities that we'd expect to see in the marsh? And we'll be doing that work in the coming year as well. So trying to, again, make it a little more real. And that leads us into some of the monitoring / research that we've been doing. I'm going to focus on the waterfowl rails and the fish food production, but I've also highlighted on here northern harriers and western pond turtles. We'll be kicking off this next year telemetry studies on both species in the marsh, looking at how they're using habitat, their foraging ecology, how we can develop management recommendations for private landowners to promote these species really. And again, my start going down that road of promoting native species in the marsh. These are species of harriers are species of special concern. Pond turtles are a candidate species for listing. So what can we do for them in the marsh? But I won't dive into any of that stuff. Maybe next year I can come give you an update on some of this work as well. So when I took over this position, one of the things I asked it right away is, since 74 in the Suisun Marsh Preservation Act, where we're charged with maintaining wintering waterfowl populations, how have we done? And well, since that time, we've had 5 species that have shown a significant decline in the wintertime. And that decline goes anywhere from 24% in scaup to 82 to 83% in cinnamon teal and pintail. So huge declines in those 2 species.
So a question on that, is that 83%, meaning 17% are left, or 83% of the population is left?
17% of what we had in the 70s.
Okay, so the 83% represents an 83% drop.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then also how have you compared how that compares to the total population, like redheads in general?
Yeah, and I've started to do it, that begs the question, and we're trying to get at some of that. Where is the population delineation of these species? And pintail overall have declined roughly 70% nationwide, but the Pacific flyway has seen much less of a decline. So we think with some pintail there's been some shift towards, when you have 600,000 acres of flooded rice in the Sacramento Valley, those birds are probably staying there. But we're trying to answer some of those questions because, it gets at that. Is it a shift in wintering habitat conditions? Is it poor wintering habitat that we're providing? Is it something on the breeding grounds? And some of the pintail is something that hunters cherish, so they've been fairly well studied. Redheads, we know almost nothing about, and we're kicking off some of the first work on the redheads in the West. And scaup is an interesting one because one of the problems we face, there's actually 2 species of scaup, greater scaup and lesser scaup. They both winter in the state. Both breeding populations are doing different things, but they're so difficult to tell apart that all the survey work that's ever been done just classifies them as scaup. That's not real helpful from a management perspective. And so we've kicked off, I hired John Sterling, who's a very well-accomplished ornithologist out of Davis. And he's doing statewide scaup surveys, breaking them down so we can have a ratio of greater to lesser for the first time and understand, again, tying that back to breeding conditions and migratory pathways as well. So lots of uncertainties with these declines. And that leads me to a list of scientific and biological uncertainties that as I started diving into this work said, first and foremost, we're charged with providing high-quality waterfowl food. But only 3 of the 23 species that winter in the marsh have ever been studied. So we really don't know what waterfowl are eating in the marsh, which really puts us in a quandary when our mitigation requirements clearly state provide high-quality foods. And so, like, what do we do with that? And again, it gets back, quite honestly, to graduate students largely. Graduate students historically have been waterfowl hunters. Waterfowl hunters like to shoot mallards and pintail. Therefore, they go into a graduate program studying mallards and pintail. Very few people get in there and study ruddy ducks or surf scoters or scaup or really a lot of the prominent species we have. So we know almost nothing about their habits and food habits in the wintertime. That then leads right into we have no idea how to manage for those food practices. We really don't understand the significance of the area's breeding waterfowl population. We know through work from California Waterfowl Association that there is a significant breeding population in the marsh, but how does that translate to wintering populations? We really didn't know much at all. And then ultimately we've got these 30-year plus data sets. Can we use those to inform management of duck clubs to promote these populations? And again, that nebulous, we're charged with doing good things for native wildlife. Which ones and how do we do that? So faced with those uncertainties, moving into a new position, I quickly formed in 2014 the Suisun Marsh Waterfowl and Management Wetland Research Program. Really a research partnership between USGS, DWR, Suisun Resource Conservation District, Ducks Unlimited and California Waterfowl Association, Fish and Wildlife and U.S. Fish and Wildlife, as well as UC Davis. Folks that had a long history of working in the marsh, had a vested interest in the resources in the marsh, brought everybody together, identified these uncertainties, found funding here and there, used DWR funding here and there to really start diving into some of these research programs, questions, and actually got enough money to kick off a couple 10-year studies. So we're in year 2 of 2 different 10-year studies with this notion of, again, we've done a lot of graduate work in the marsh, which gives us 1 or 2, maybe 3-year snapshot of things. But how can we learn about wet years, dry years, and normal years in the marsh and how wildlife and fish respond in those situations? And doing some modeling, on average, a 10-year study in the region gives you about an 80% chance of getting a wet, dry, and normal year. So we went with 80% is good enough, and went with 10 years. So the goals of this program, 3 main goals. First, being wintering waterfowl, getting at our main questions, assessing the value of food types and different wetland habitats to waterfowl in the marsh, and then ultimately identifying the management actions that increase the food values and the carrying capacity. And we're getting at that. Our goal is for up to 13 species of waterfowl to examine habitat use and movements using telemetry. We now have the technology. We can see more than anything where these birds go at night with telemetry. Where in my day of graduate school, we had the radio telemetry. You got your headphones on and your big antenna, and you listen for beeps. And you're not going to find them at night that way. But now with the technology, and I'll show you some of it, you can start understanding where these birds are going all times of the day. And that really informs their habitat use and the foods they're eating. And again, getting back to promoting food production and management practices. And I had to throw in, there's my little man banding some waterfowl, doing his share for monitoring. My future biologist. And then our program goals for breeding waterfowl, understanding the significance of the Suisun Marsh breeding duck population, and then examining the nesting ecology of mallards, gadwall, and cinnamon teal, our three prominent nesting species in the marsh, and using telemetry to follow birds again and evaluate really their habitat use and one of the big unknowns, what they do when they're done nesting, when they're done with their brood rearing responsibilities. Where do they go? What's their survival like? What are those critical habitat features? And my first goal with native wildlife, if you will, was to look at ridgeway, clapper or ridgeways rails, and black rails in the marsh. Historically, these birds have been present in the Suisun Marsh, but if you know anything about rails, they're very difficult to detect. And some of the historic data we have is questionable. They're hard to hard to distinguish a clapper rail call from a yellow rail call. It takes, even experts at times get confused with that. So the question became, given the technology we have today, could we use these audio recording devices? Essentially boxes about yay big that record everything it hears 24 hours a day. Could we go back to that and then identify rail calls and actually find these birds in the marsh? So we've, and one of the goals then would be, if we found the birds, to start looking at their habitat use, do some telemetry, and work. We have management constraints on private duck clubs, on the wildlife area due to these species, but they don't really have any biological significance since we don't have any real data on them. So could we work to then develop meaningful conservation measures? And well, after 2 years of putting these devices out where we thought the best suitable habitat is in the marsh, we haven't been able to find any clapper rails, ridgeway rails, anywhere in the marsh, and beginning to believe that the habitat just isn't there. Working with folks in the bay, beginning to believe more and more that the times that they've showed up in the marsh, when the bay population gets large enough, they kind of spill over to the marsh, explore young birds exploring new areas, but the habitat isn't there for them to become established. But we're going to keep going. This is work we funded for 10 years. We're starting to find some black rails and trying to narrow down areas where they may occur. And I hope within the next couple of years to do some focused habitat work and follow these birds, understand some of their movement patterns and even their migratory patterns. So again, these are birds that occur on duck clubs. So ultimately, how can we develop then management practices to promote these species within regular duck club management? So again, very, very, very data rich. It's a different environment than, again, the telemetry work that I did, where you get one, I used to get in a plane and fly from Sacramento to Eastern Oregon, and if I heard 2 beeps, that was a good day. We got 2 birds in that flight. And it's not that way now. With this technology, it's a ton of data. So very much takes someone who knows what they're doing with data sets and computers. So moving into some of the wintering waterfowl work that we've done to date, we've marked 326 birds with cell tower transmitters, 8 different species of waterfowl. The cell tower transmitters are really a lot like a cell phone. Essentially, the transmitter, there's one pictured on that Drake mallard there, acts like a cell phone. So when it's in coverage, in a good location, every 30 minutes we'll get a text message with a GPS coordinate. And the GPS coordinate is good to about 3 to 4 meters. So fairly good resolution. So just like a cell phone, if it gets out of coverage, we don't get any communication with it, but the transmitter continues to record data. So when the bird comes back into cell coverage, we get that downloaded data. And then it can reset. We can actually get online, track the transmitter, reset it, clear the memory, and keep going. And you can see in this picture, the top of the transmitter actually has a little solar panel on it. So the solar panel keeps the battery charged, keeps it going. As long as the bird stays alive and the transmitter stays attached, we've been able to get data on a number of birds for over 2 years now. So first time we've ever been able to track any individuals from all the way through the cycle, and now more than once. So learning a ton about some of our hen mallards and hen gadwall nesting in the area, and their body condition resulting in their nest success, and some of those cross-seasonal effects that we've wondered about for so long. So again, very, very data rich. We're well over 1 million data points already into this study. So the way we tackled that last year, hired 2 postdocs through UC Davis and USGS, and really all their job is to analyze data, process data, analyze it, get it out in a usable format, and get it out to managers on the ground. We're working with folks really all over, well, almost all over the United States and Canada, getting this information out so people know what's going on and coordinating with them. And getting papers published. We've got 5 papers in review right now, just from the first 2 years of data. So Very, very interesting stuff, and I'll show you some of this data here. This is an example from pintail. This is graphs of pintail wintering in the Suisun Marsh, and you can see this one example, the first one, number 62 here. She traveled just between hunting season, October to January, over 1,500 miles. These birds aren't sitting still. They're covering a lot of ground, really highlighting the importance to us of providing high-quality wintering waterfowl foods. And yeah, very, very, very interesting how much they move around. Similarly, number 46 there, when she finally left Suisun to nest, traveled 2,732 miles before she finally made it to Alaska to settle down on a nest. And that's not a direct flight. A direct flight is closer to about 1,100 miles, if I remember off the top of my head. So these birds are going all over the place before they settle down. And interestingly, some of the fun things we can do. Number 62 there, she traveled 1,500 miles over the winter. When she finally got up and left and went to Alaska, her one long stint was 816 miles nonstop in 16 hours, and she averaged 51 miles an hour. So yeah, these birds can get up, and that was an average. She had peak speeds well over 60 miles an hour. So these birds can get up and go too. One of the things that the data showed very clearly, getting back to that connectivity between the Suisun Marsh, the Delta, and the Central Valley. These birds are going back and forth a lot and using those habitats a lot. This next series of slides, showing how different species really use the landscape and that connectivity back to the marsh. Starting with a more localized population, cinnamon teal. We're trying to get at how cinnamon teal are using wintering landscape and breeding. In our wintering birds, you can see in addition to the marsh, we're using the Sacramento and San Joaquin Valley a lot. If we go to Gadwall, they're using all those and the Klamath Basin. The Klamath Basin, northeastern California, southeastern Oregon, very important to them. Mallards then go even further into the Canadian prairie pothole region in eastern Washington and Oregon. So spread even further. American widgeon even further into the prairie pothole region in Washington. Shovelers, interestingly, used a lot of the Pacific Northwest and that corridor. So using the landscape very different. And canvasback, again, doing something even more different, using the Intermountain West areas. Very important areas in Nevada, Utah, the Great Salt Lake, portions of Colorado, southern Idaho, very important to canvasbacks. So these birds that are wintering in the marsh are going all over the West, and then you have pintail. And our pintail that are wintering in Suisun are almost using the entirety of North America. They're nesting anywhere from North Dakota to the Arctic Circle, parts of Alaska, using a coastal corridor, going through the prairies. We even have interchange with birds in the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. We had some birds going into Louisiana and Mississippi and coming back to Sacramento area. So pretty amazing, the connectivity between, our 50,000 acres of managed wetlands and where these birds go throughout the West and throughout the country. And same notion here, we started looking at that from breeding birds in the marsh. So this data set goes all the way back to the 30s. This is birds banded during breeding season in the Suisun Marsh. So adult females primarily and young of the year. And then the dots are where they were recovered, largely shot by hunters, hunter recoveries. And again, you can see birds breeding in the marsh disperse all over North America. And we actually had one pintail you can see in the bottom left corner there. We can only guess where she was going, but some of the telemetry work we've done has shown these birds will take some long ocean flights. This bird, the account reads that she landed on a large fishing vessel and looked exhausted and worn out. and within 6-10 hours was dead on the boat. Turned out to be banded. Turned out to be a guy who fished and hunted and knew what to do with the band and reported it. She may have been, I was talking before this, she may have been on her way to Japan. There's a connectivity with pintail in the Central Valley in Japan as well. So she may have been going that way. But, so yeah, birds in the marsh are dispersing all over North America, really. And to give you an idea of the significance of the marsh to breeding waterfowl and that potential, a lot of graphs here, but want to give you, this is just for Grizzly Island Wildlife Area, looking at the number of nests found in any given year for these different species. So just to give you a range of magnitude, you know, in any given year, mallards, you can find 600, 700, 800 nests at Grizzly Island Wildlife Area. Gadwalls, you know, up in the hundreds as well. Pintail are hit and miss. Cinnamon teal, much less. Shoveler all over the place. One of the things that got us looking at harriers, you can see, at least historically, there was up over 60, 70 harrier nests in Grizzly Island Wildlife Area. That kind of abundance is unheard of anywhere, really, in the state. So this is just the wildlife area, not the private lands, all the other acreages out there. So looking at this long-term data set, one of the longest running nesting waterfowl studies in the country, gave us an idea of what the potential is out there and the magnitude. And the next question is, with all those nests, how well are they doing? And interestingly, for mallards, which is the longest data set and the most abundant sample, any given year you can have 75% nest success to really a bottom of around 15%, 10 to 15% nest success, which is what we think is necessary to maintain a stable population. So these birds are doing pretty well. And when you compare that nest success to more prominent breeding areas like the Prairie Pothole region, North Dakota, this is on par or better than anywhere in the country. So lots of birds and high nest success. And one of the questions that came to mind that we're evaluating very closely is these birds, ducklings, when they hatch, they go right to water. Their surface area to volume ratio is such that they're very susceptible to dehydration. They need to get to water. They need to drink. Well, question is, what bodies of water are they using, and what's the salinity of that water? And is there potential for them to be using water that, one, impairs growth, or two, outright kills them? And as this figure shows, this was 2 years ago, really the only habitat that's good on this figure is the dark blue. And I think there's two or so dark blue ponds in the bottom left of the screen. Everything else that we monitored out there, all those dots, are impairing growth or lethal to ducklings. So we're providing habitat for hundreds of birds to nest, and then they're going to use water, at least during that year, that is the studies we did that year on brood survival, we saw total brood rate loss rates of undocumented amounts. I mean, nobody had ever seen rates that high. And we think what happened, they were using habitat that was impairing their ability to move, to behave normally, and they were getting eaten by predators very quickly. So again, working with the landowners to manage water differently on their properties, working with the wildlife area to provide fresher water, to circulate water, or to just simply not have brood ponds during drought conditions, things of that nature. So trying to make it more real on the landscape. And we're working with Josh Ackerman at USGS and John Eady at UC Davis to really dive into this work and track birds and work with landowners. Which leads me to this notion of providing fish food from duck hunting clubs. And something I get from landowners all the time, this idea, what? We're going to provide fish food? And I guess it was Peter Moyle and John Durant, UC Davis, 3 years ago now, working on the Nurse Slough complex in Denverton area of the Suisun Marsh, where they started to notice a great diversity of fish in the area and increased nutrients in those sloughs and the duck club. So the duck club, typical duck club operation, they flood up in the fall, they drain in the spring. When they were draining in the spring, that water going into the sloughs was providing a lot of nutrients and stimulating zooplankton and phytoplankton development, which in turn then they hypothesized was providing a lot of food for fish. So we've been working with them and then San Francisco State to look at that, in this case at Joyce Island Duck Club, and monitoring those things. And unfortunately, this year was going to be our second field season, and with all the rain we got this winter and all the flooding, everything got blown out this spring and we weren't able to get out there. But with 1 year of data, we've been able to show really what Moyle was thinking. By managing things like residence time, how long the water stays on the pond, when you put it in, you can see much higher chlorophyll concentrations, which essentially then are indicators of zooplankton abundance in the area. So leads us down that road. So the idea being, like Joyce Island in this picture, you can see Grizzly Bay in the bottom left, and then the Roaring River Montezuma Slough Complex adjacent to Joyce Island. So the idea being we have long-term fish sampling there, and we know that when fish are in that area from our monthly surveys. Could we hold water on those clubs until fish are going to be in the area, dump it, and provide food? And there's a lot of potential for it. We're working with 2 other duck clubs to expand this work. So hopefully next year we'll have a sample of 3 to 5 duck clubs spread throughout the marsh. And in general, duck clubs are really excited about doing this work. A lot of these guys, they fancy themselves conservationists, and they like to fish and hunt, and they can relate to fish, and so it's something that's a real easy sell for them. And then we're working, one of the things we need to do to make this a reality on the landscape, the Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy, I should say, also called out this action. We were doing the work before the strategy started, but it calls for us to coordinate flood up and drainage schedules with landowners to try to provide food for Delta Smelt. So we have that push from Resources Agency as well. And we're going to be, this winter, taking an inventory of all the clubs in the marsh and saying, what are their basic infrastructure? What size pipe do they have? How many structures do they have? What's their elevation? And how quickly could they flood and drain? So if we selected a club and said, hey, do you want to participate in the study? We know they have the infrastructure. If they don't, and they're in an area that we think is important for fish, what do we need to do then to upgrade that and work with them to upgrade it, find the funds to do that. So we'll be doing that inventory this winter as well and working with all the landowners so that we can hopefully 2 years from now then take a more landscape approach to this and apply it and set up the monitoring along with that. So a lot more to come with it, but a lot of momentum right now, a lot of interest in it. And the real question from a duck hunting perspective is, if these guys hold water, right now Delta Smelt, the period that seems to be important in the marsh is August, September-ish. And so that's a time when they generally don't have water on their clubs. So if they divert water in, say June, hold it for a month, and then dump water, how does that change the vegetation on their club, their management needs, and potential waterfowl use? And nicely, we have a lot of transmitters on waterfowl in the wintertime, so we can see if there's any change in their use. We can look at the plant communities to see if they change. We're going to have to work with clubs to initially offset any increased management cost. And some of that will just be staff time, getting someone on the ground to open those gates to monitor water levels, working closely. You'll meet Steve Chappelle tomorrow, working with his staff at Suisun Resource Conservation District to just get out there and do those things. So a lot of coordination with it as well, but moving forward. And yeah, this kind of gets at some of those things I said. Our preliminary conclusions from Joyce Island and Peter Moyle's work is there's times when we can produce a lot of zooplankton, both in clubs and outside of clubs in the sloughs. But the real key is figuring out residence time. How long does that water need to sit?
How long do you have to cook those plants, essentially, to provide that? And then what both Moyle and Hammerer want is more years of sampling. 1 year of data isn't enough. So we're working closely with them to look at that. And look at, much like with our waterfowl studies and our rail work, how does that change over time, monthly as well as yearly, different environmental variation and stochasticity, if you will. How do those things change, and how can we manage for that? Provide one of the thoughts is if we can provide a more stable food source than what would occur naturally, that could benefit smelt and young salmon as well. So trying to get at those things. And with that, I've one of the 10-year agreements we got into last year with UC Davis. Really, my goal, we have a number of folks working in the marsh for a number of years. Moyle, John Eady, working with birds and waterfowl. Douglas Kelt's lab, working with salt marsh harvest mice. And then I wanted to bring in Brian Todd, working with western pond turtles. Pond turtles seem to be abundant in the marsh, so let's understand how they're used in habitat. But really have these labs work together. Break down the barriers in the silos, if you will, and start designing research together, start looking at it as a system approach. How can management benefit all those suites of species? And very excited. We've had the contract for a year, starting to develop collaborative research proposals, getting graduate students in that are doing a crossover. Looking at western pond turtle use versus different salinity, comparing that with waterfowl and rail use, and bringing it together as a system. Again, getting back to how do we develop management strategies. So kicking off a strong research team. And then they're working closely with our partners in the research program. So a lot of moving parts, a lot of different things going on. I said we'll be adding harriers to this list as well this next year, and hoping to do some more comprehensive bird work. One of the things that's missing in the marsh is just general bird surveys. Unlike a lot of other wetland areas in the Central Valley, we really don't have any public areas. You don't have like a Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge or a San Luis National Wildlife Refuge that caters to birders, that caters to people getting out there looking for birds. And so we don't have any of that citizen data, if you will, to point towards what the diversity and abundance of different species are, largely because it's all private land. So we're trying to get that kicked off this next year as well. And then one last element I added last year, coming from a waterfowl background, the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, which it's supposed to be updated every 3 to 5 years. you know how updates go and how they sometimes don't meet their targets. But the most recent update challenged us as waterfowl and wetland managers to look at the human dimension side. They made a strong argument that we've done a great job of studying the resource. We know a lot about wetlands, we know a lot about waterfowl, but we don't know much at all about the human side of it. The people who are out recreating in that environment, the people who are simply driving through that environment. We don't know the people who own lands with those habitats. We don't understand their viewpoints and their ideas, and challenged us as managers to learn about that human element. And as I started thinking about it, again, looking at the marsh and the abundance of private land, the only way we can achieve any conservation is working with the private landowners. So I really wanted to get at the question, what drives habitat conservation decisions by Suisun Marsh landowners? And how do we better apply those conservation actions? We're investing millions of dollars in understanding how fish and wildlife use the landscape. How do we translate that into management actions on the ground? Is it the message? Is it how we deliver? Who's delivering the message? Is it, as some people have argued, simply money? Give people enough money, they'll do anything. Well, we're hopefully going to get at some of that. One of the things we discovered last year is a simple networking concept.
there's, if you will, certain clubs in the marsh that have a history of shooting real well and being managed real well. And we're coming to find out who those clubs are. And, say, for instance, if you go with the Can Club and you convince them to do the work, getting all the surrounding clubs to do it is real easy because they're all going to do it because the Can Club did it. So some of that social networking, how do we get that stuff done on the ground? So very, very interesting. I, as a scientist, had never thought about it from that standpoint. How do we get these things done? This next year, last year, we did a lot of on-the-ground surveys, questionnaires, meeting with everything from birders to fishermen to duck hunters to kayakers, just getting real viewpoints, ideas. This next year, we've hired a firm, Responsive Management. And Responsive Management got a great track record of working on these types of surveys throughout Canada and the U.S., and their specialty is phone surveys. So they'll be working with our state Fish and Wildlife to get contact information for folks who buy hunting and fishing licenses, and then do random phone surveys with questionnaires and get at some of those viewpoints and get some of those conservation ethics, if you will, and ideas, and hopefully help us implement conservation at a local level much more. So something I'm very excited about because, I say, never really thought about it before. But again, so important when we're charged with mitigation actions on land we don't own. How do we accomplish that? We got to work with private landowners, and the only way to do that is to better understand them and their viewpoints. Mm-hmm.
Are you asking them about their attitudes about climate change and sea level rise?
Particularly sea level rise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Do
for sure.
you have any feelings of how the landowners view this topic?
I think it's about 50-50 in the discussions I've had. I think about half the landowners are one in denial and one outright just don't believe it.
Your statistic that the ducklings are harmed by 2 parts per thousand, that
exactly.
really got my attention.
And I think the change in salinity, some of these guys have seen it from the water project diversions and everything else. And so it's very real to them.
Yeah. And I didn't realize that 12 parts per thousand was lethal. So exploit those numbers if you need
right.
to. Yeah.
I think that's how we're going to reach people. And I think, the argument that I've made to some club owners with some of this is that, salinity is going to increase regardless. We're going to have increased demand on our water supply, which undoubtedly is going to be more diversions from the delta. So we're going to have increased salinity even in the short term, and then the long term with climate change on top of that. So we've got to prepare for it. But yeah, it's a sticky political question for these guys. But I'm interested in getting it at some of those. Like I say, it's very real to our management actions and how we respond. I think the marsh is shaping up to really tackle some of the climate change issues in a very unique way. Since we have the management infrastructure, we can really set up a monitoring system and do the laboratory work now with things like how plants respond to increasing salinity. And say, okay, given different salinity scenarios, how do we expect plant communities to change? And what plants can we promote under those different scenarios to maintain wildlife values? Because we have such a highly managed area. And it's something I'm working with folks on right now to lay that groundwork. So I think we'll see most people respond positively. But we'll see. Yeah, I'd be happy to come back and share some of that stuff with you. And really, if there's one of the things I've been trying to do with this work is reach out to my partners and say, from that human dimension standpoint, are there questions of interest that we could ask? That would inform your work and your decision making as well. So please think about those things and feel free to provide me that feedback. I can follow up. Edmund's got my email and contact information as well. Mm-hmm.
You've repeatedly spoke of the duck clubs as private land. How do they think of the waterfowl? Are they private waterfowl, or are they a public trust?
I think by far and away they think of it as a public trust, largely because I think ingrained in them is the notion, like some of those slides showed, that these birds are going all over the place, and they appreciate seeing them in other places. A lot of these guys have hunted all over the country, so they see it as everybody's resource. And I know a lot of them love getting other people out just to see the birds, just to be a part of that.
But then their private land is part of the maintenance of that trust.
Yeah, for sure. And,
And
really,
then the Department of Water Resources is providing a public service on a private land to maintain the public trust.
Exactly.
And so why is it awkward?
Well, because it's politically awkward more than anything.
Yeah.
And that's something really, when I took this position, it's the first time in the history of the program that, if you will, it wasn't run by an engineer. And so I come from a waterfowl background. I hunt ducks. My 11-year-old son gets out hunting ducks with me. And I studied waterfowl. So the landowners see me. A number of the landowners, when I got the position, knew about it before other people did, because they were just in that realm, and they were excited that someone who presumably had their interest in mind was in this position. And so I'm capitalizing on that and working with them that way. And getting back to this notion of public trust, the waterfowl hunters in particular have a long history of really providing for that public trust. Going all the way back to the federal duck stamp in 1935, a voluntary legislation and tax that funds all our national wildlife refuges purchases. And they've always saw that as a public trust, as opposed to, hey, we're going to buy this refuge so that we can hunt our ducks there. So I think it's a long ingrained history of doing that. And it's capitalizing on those things, and we're going to do it. Really, the challenge is getting this next, it brings up the challenge really is getting this next generation of young people interested in waterfowl hunting and maintaining those clubs. And it's a different generation.
I know John Eady has a program, and I think it's a Suisun, where about half the wildlife majors have never hunted at Davis, and he's taking them out and having them deal with this. Could you just describe this a little? It's a very, very interesting project.
Yeah, I've worked on a couple of those with him, and so the idea is he takes wildlife majors at UC Davis, wildlife fish and conservation majors that have never hunted before, but have an interest in learning something about it, seeing about it, taking them out to the Suisun Marsh, actively showing them duck hunting clubs, duck club management, everything that's going on out there, give them the opportunity to get a hunting license, and taking them hunting. And they go out hunting with people who are very experienced. A number of people come and give talks over the days, talk about what waterfowl conservation means. I've given 3 or 4 different talks about how we manage waterfowl in the state. Really show these students the conservation value and what's been happening. And then, like I say, take them hunting the next morning if they're interested in it. Clean ducks with them, have a barbecue that afternoon, and eat what they've killed. And by far and away, vast majority of students who go through there, their eyes are just opened up to, they had no idea that any of that ever took place. Their notion of hunting was much more barbaric, if you will, than anything like that. They're blown away that some of these duck clubs, people are paying thousands, if not tens of thousands a year to be a part of this club and maintain the habitat. They had no idea that anybody was paying for that type of resource, and that was happening on the ground. And we show them the shorebirds out there, the other critters that are using the habitat as well. So fantastic program. And actually got word, I guess last month, that Clemson, Dr. Rick, blanking on Rick's last name, is starting a similar program on the East Coast. So catching on. That's a great program. In conjunction with California Waterfowl, we should say too. But I work very closely with John on that. Let's see how we're doing on time.
We've
Can't really
got
get into
about
restoration
10 minutes
stuff.
before we take our next
I
break.
don't have much on the restoration side. Let me say before get me talking about research. Pull that, yeah, really, all I wanted to bring to your attention from a restoration standpoint. The marsh is in a unique situation. We, in 2014, signed the record of decision for what we call the Suisun Marsh Plan, EIR-EIS, and it's a programmatic document to facilitate 5,000 to 7,000 acres of tidal restoration in the marsh. The big mitigation, if you will, is to offset the impact to waterfowl from tidal restoration. What we know about waterfowl use of tidal wetlands is very little value, very little food value. So to offset the 5,000 to 7,000 acres of tidal restoration, we need to enhance 44,000 to 46,000 acres of managed wetlands for waterfowl. And we have that framed up. This was unlike other tidal restoration efforts, this isn't driven by a biological opinion. This is a goal we have. It's not a regulatory requirement. It goes back to the CalFed days of identifying the need to do tidal restoration for native fish in the marsh. And really over, I think it was a 14-year process of working with local stakeholders, working with the agencies to identify suitable regions, have habitat target acres in each region to ensure that waterfowl and other resources were maintained, that it was done in a way that promoted the overall values of the marsh. And through this, then, the two properties we'll look at tomorrow, Tule Red restoration, which is actually being done with the state water contractors and Westervelt. Westervelt being a mitigation company. And again, since this isn't mitigation requirements, it's a facilitation of let's get the habitat on the ground. We don't care if it's a mitigation bank. We don't care if it's a private landowner. We want to see the habitat values. And that's one of the benefits we have. And then the other property we'll look at, Bradmore Island. DWR now owns the entire island, and we're in the planning phase, hopefully in 2 years of going to restoration out there. And we'll see the island and some of the restoration. Some of my staff will be there that know the restoration design of the property much better than I do. And Westervelt will be on site tomorrow to show you Tule Red and talk about those habitat features and some of the permitting challenges that they faced. One of our real challenges right now is an agency, BCDC, which is what Bay Area Council Development Commission. They've had a change in their staff and their leadership, and they've really, frankly, disregarded a couple decades of working with us on implementing Suisun Marsh goals and are trying to push through policies that they do in the Bay. And so one of the things they did at Tule Red was literally last minute come in with a permit requirement that they had to allow public access on the site. And it had to be for public recreation. And it's just not feasible. It's just like, what? Wait. You're literally 2 weeks before going to construction saying something like that and making it a permit requirement. And luckily we were able to work with them. My staff and Steve Chappelle worked with them very closely. And we got them to back down a little bit and basically say, look, if this is going to be a requirement for all tidal restoration projects in the marsh, we need to do this in a more systematic approach. Let's do a comprehensive review of all the public access in the Suisun Marsh. What do we have? Where could we do better? Where could we improve things? And where could we create new facilities? Develop that implementation strategy first, not just required on every parcel. But they've been very, very challenging to work with that way. And I know Rob Capriola, the lead for Westervelt, will have some choice words to say about that, because it's been very, very challenging and one of our continual permitting challenges.
Okay, well, Cliff, I want to thank you
Oh, yeah.
again for a real informative presentation, and I know we're all anxious to get out there and see it up close and personal. Any questions while we have Cliff? Yeah, Vance.
Quick one. I remember for years ago, there were big conflicts between the residents of Fairfield and the management of the marsh on mosquito production. Is that still there, or is it? Yes.
There's
Yeah.
I mean, you can even see that beginning picture I had where Suisun City and Fairfield have developed right on the edge of the wetland. Well, you know, if you build a house on the edge of the wetland, there are going to be mosquitoes, you know. But certainly they've done a much better job of spraying and implementing management practices. We've developed management practices to prevent mosquitoes simply through water management, stabilizing water, reducing floating vegetation, those types of things. So it's gotten better through education and implementation, but it's an easy thing to point a finger at.
Any other questions? Brian? Okay, Brian doesn't have any questions. Well, thanks again, Cliff.
No, thank you. And I won't likely make the whole field trip tomorrow, but we'll be having lunch at a duck club, an old duck club. Used to be owned by Ken Hoffman, who owned the Oakland A's at the time. Has a big A's insignia on the side of it. Nice facility. We'll talk a little bit about duck club management. I'll try to get out there for lunch at least. We can talk some more if you have any questions and follow up.
All right, thanks again.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Okay, we're scheduled for a 10-minute break.
Yes.
Yes.
But when we still have Cliff here, can we talk about the field trip logistics really quick?
Yeah, we can talk offline, yeah.
So Cliff, I'm not sure if you saw some of the,
Yeah.
Oh. Do we have a public comment on this, Edmund?
No, not this one. So tomorrow, the plan was that we'll meet at DWR's West Sacramento office at 7 a.m., but there was some interest from some members of the board to push it slightly. We're just wondering if there's a possibility by like 30 minutes, like 7:30 or 8, rather than 7, would that work for you or any of the presenters? I know it's kind of late right now.
But I'm sure that, yeah, I don't think that'll be a problem on our end.
Okay. So on that end, I'll leave it up to the board whether you guys would like to adjust the time, but just keep in mind that the public will have to have enough time to be informed about the change.
So currently it's scheduled that we were going to meet at 7 and then go get breakfast or something?
The plan is that we'll leave at 7 from West Sacramento, and then we'll go to Suisun City at McDonald's for a break and to catch up with anyone who doesn't, because we're going to be taking multiple vehicles, so we'll have a meetup location at McDonald's.
How long are we scheduled to be there?
McDonald's. It depends on traffic, so if we're behind schedule, then it'll be quicker, but I think it was like 15 to 20 minutes to grab something to eat. Most of it will be like a vehicle ride, but Cliff can correct me if I'm wrong, so you guys can grab something to go and eat in the vehicle.
I think we all see the schedule is pretty fluid. You know, really about let's get out to some sites, have a discussion about what's going on, and how long we stay there is really a product of how much discussion there is and how much interest there is. So, you know, we'll see how the day goes. If we don't make it to a site, we'll save it for next time. Or
Tracy's suggesting we start at 8, but if we stop at McDonald's just for coffee, not even coffee, just other boards, any thoughts? Vince, I'm looking at you.
My kids will laugh hysterically that I eat breakfast at McDonald's.
Yeah, I'm not allowed to do that.
Well, if 8 o'clock is fine and it doesn't affect anybody, then why don't we do that? And then people, if want to have breakfast, they can have breakfast before, because I know some places don't open before 8 or before 7. Okay? Is that all right?
All right, if there aren't any objections, we'll try to send out a notice during our break about changing our start time to 8. And that would also mean there's a possibility of coming back later than 5:30. Okay, so if you guys are watching on the webcast, just know that we'll be sending out a meeting note or meeting revision soon, and we'll contact folks who have informed us that they would like to join the tour. And on that note, I would like to thank Cliff for giving a very informative presentation. One of the purposes of this presentation and the field tour is to help inform the monitoring enterprise review, and hopefully the work group jump-started a few ideas about monitoring in Suisun and the Delta. So let's give a round of applause to Cliff.
Okay, we can reconvene at 2:20. Well, the next item is item number 10, and this is perhaps one of the more important items in many respects because it's going to set the pace of what we'll be doing over the next few years. In July, we had what we called a retreat, and we had a number of panelists come in and give us their ideas of what they felt were some of the most important issues facing the Delta, where an evaluation of the science might be, by the Independent Science Board, might be of value to the agencies. And from that, and we also sent out questionnaires for a number of folks, for those people who could not be here at the panel, and we got a number of ideas from those folks as well. And from that, we distilled it down into 4 primary thematic areas, and then a variety of things that we felt would be useful to do, and or at least look at in each of the reviews that we do, climate change being one of those. Part of the rationale for doing this is that we are winding down on some of the very major responsibilities we've had, BDCP, water fix. We've just wrapped up the CSO document, and currently we're working on 2 reviews. One is the water quality review, and we now have a draft of that water quality review. And the other one, which we've recently embarked on, is a monitoring review, which will be occurring at least through the end of next year, probably. So the thought is that we should think about what are the most important reviews that we should be doing, which ones do we have time to do in terms of just the people we have and the amount of effort that they can put into one of these, and what might be the time frame. In general, the thought was to maybe scope out our primary activities for the next 2 to 3 years. Each of our reviews take, I want to say, a minimum of a year, and often, sometimes, I want to say 4. I was going to say 3, but apparently 4. You know, and another thought along this line, in about 3 years, we're going to have a significant turnover of the board, so this might play out some of the major things we can do before that happens. So, and I know we have limited time, we have a limited number of board members, and in terms of a number of thematic reviews we can take on at a time. So we want to open the discussion, I guess, and to talk about which ones are those reviews that are extremely important, and then which ones that we want to move forward on. And in many respects, that'll take a sort of a volunteer work group to take the initial lead on scoping that review out, and then think about which ones we might want to be able to, or might be better to postpone and do it sequentially, or but still trying to kind of at least get it on the cards. And I think, I'm going to look at Edmund, but I think is the September 9th document, that's the public document?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and in that one, we've identified 4 thematic reviews. One is water supply reliability, one is ecosystems, one is restoration, one is water quality 2, the follow-up to, I guess, water quality 1. And then we have, in each of those thematic reviews, we identified a number of things that we thought should be at least considered for those reviews. Like we talked about the climate change, the connections upstream into the bay, the state of the science, the modeling and forecasting capabilities, the level of uncertainty, broad science vision, and science and social system linkages. Now, we also had some other topics we discussed. One of those that has risen, and we talked about earlier today, was whether or not the programmatic review of IEP should be done. That would be added to a level of a thematic review in the sense of being something that is derived from us and done. There's also been some discussion of climate changes possibly. It's right now it's in a category that would have us look at it in each of the topical reviews, but not necessarily do it as a major review. But I know there's been a couple of folks that have suggested that, and for each of those 4 topics, we've had folks prepare sort of a couple of key questions on that, and I know there's some discussion about possibly merging some or parts of the ecosystem and the restoration topics. Is there something we could do that would be a merging of some of those? So that's sort of where we're at, and I would really like to get to a stage where we can set some priorities. What might be the number 1 or number 2 major review that we would do next, and who might be taking the leads on that, and even think about the secondary characteristics. Edmund, you look like you want to say something.
Oh no, I'm just rapidly trying to reschedule your start time for the field tour. Sorry if I'm on my phone.
All right, so let's open the discussion. John?
I'm hesitant to open my mouth because I know where this will lead. But I think we've had some, among the group that's been circulating ideas on the ecosystem/restoration review, there's the recognition that this fits in with what the council is doing on their ecosystem amendment. And it seems to me that therefore almost has to be a high priority. Whether we combine them, or I think the latest thinking was do them in a complementary tandem simultaneously kind of thing. They're related, but they don't fit together totally with each other without diluting the other part. But I think that however it's done, I think doing something in that ecosystem/restoration arena to fit in with what the council's priorities are makes a lot of sense.
Yes, Troy?
Yes, the most recent thinking was to have those 2 ecosystem and restoration reviews closely coordinated and done in tandem, so that it's very clear that we won't be overlapping and reinventing the wheel, because there's a lot of potential overlap, and it's to be taken advantage of rather than avoided, just making sure we don't repeat ourselves. Oh, okay. So Vince was asking me about whether or not we could do a short, like 1-page summary of the first restoration review. And in my look at that, it seemed like the emphasis was not so much on science that was taking place that could be used in restoration, but certainly for this review, science would be the basic material.
Yeah, I think that was our first thematic review, And we were just kind of figuring out what we meant by a thematic review versus a programmatic review, so it ended up being some of both.
I think we'll still be trying to figure out what restoration is.
You and I think, have the same perspective on that. The restoration community as a whole thinks somewhat differently.
It's very
Very
flexible
contentious these
term.
days.
Difficult to put boundaries about.
So John, I also thought I heard you say that given the ecosystem amendment to the plan, that we should make sure that we go ahead with our ecosystem review because we know that request is coming from the council. Were you saying that or not? Or was I just imagining that's what you were going to say?
I'm sure that's what I said.
That's what I thought you said, so. So I think the one question is how do we know the ecosystem amendment and the request to look at the ecosystem amendment as a board is coming to us. So we might think, or perhaps now talk about what that would mean to do this, what we framed up as an ecosystem review at the same time that we have the ecosystem amendment coming to the Delta plan to look at. And I'd look to the people who have framed up the ecosystem, which is Vince and Joy and John. How do you guys see that meshing with the ecosystem amendment?
Yeah, I think we don't know yet exactly what the scope and focus of the ecosystem amendment is going to be. And my perception was that we wanted what we did in reviewing the ecosystem arena to support what the council needed, but not be restricted to what the council needed. So depending upon what the council comes up with and what their timeline is for that, it might be possible to visualize an ecosystem review that would start out by highlighting those issues that are most important to the council, but then build on that to include the broader scope that we think is important.
Yeah, I think the ecosystem amendment is still in the very early stages of development, and a large part of that is to have a number of listening sessions by who's ever going to run at the program of the council, and get a lot of feedback in, and then they would evolve what those amendments might be. And I think our role is to review the science that might be relevant to ecosystem, I want to say in quotes, and do make sure that there's some solid foundation for that. Now, if you go back to the original Delta plan, the ecosystem chapter there is largely on ecosystem restoration, but they talk about delta flows, water quality, I have it in front of me, habitat, and some of those things we have done independent reviews of, water quality and flows. There's also non-native species as one of the subcomponents, and hatcheries and harvest management, which we haven't talked at all about. And during our panel discussions and that, some of the things that came out more specific to the ecosystem, we summarized as fish and food webs, invasive species, this spatial connectivity of the delta and upstream and downstream, and then the linkages between the aquatic system and wetlands and terrestrial landscapes. Those are a lot of topics. I don't know if there's a topic within that. Invasives is clearly, but the first thing you think about as invasives is food webs and nutrient cycling, as a opponent of what their impacts might be. So I guess that, yes, we want to maintain, and I think we're certainly going to keep track of how that amendment process goes, and but I don't know that we want to wait till, I think their timeline, and I'm going to look at John over here, is something like at least a year down the road.
I would say about a year, maybe potentially less. But I would say about a year. It's the initiation really is in the next couple months. It's just later this month into October is the beginning of the listening sessions, and so I think by November, December there'll probably be a much clearer idea of exactly what would be incorporated into it. And one of the listening sessions will be with ISB, some of the subset of the ISB to get your feedback. So that's one opportunity. And then I think as it develops, there'll be more opportunities for input separate from your specific paper. Because I think they'll be moving sort of together. The chapter can't wait a year to get initiated, so it won't be, we won't get your input at the start. It'll be sort of simultaneous. But I think your feedback throughout and your ideas, as long as we have some idea of where you're headed, I think will be very useful.
Okay.
The plan amendment, I think, is scheduled to be done March 2019, so that's a good 18 months from now. But I don't think we want to wait to see how that thing tracks. I think we need to pick our own track and help them, guide them, not wait to let them guide us.
Yeah, and I think if we're careful in what we choose, and I want to say more fundamental in what we choose, it's going to be valuable for whichever sort of path the amendment process goes on.
Yeah, and all the topics you've identified, I'm certain are topics that will be a key part. So.
Yeah, and those were identified by us listening, so they're probably going to come up again. So we have a sort of a thought that certainly ecosystem or ecosystem/restoration ought to be on the front burner. Let me take a back burner one, and water quality too. And I think that was reasonably defined as looking at those constituents that you didn't look at in water quality 1. It seems to me that makes sense to get started after water quality 1 is kind of at least in a solid state. Is that, unless you want to start that one right now, Tracy?
A point of order. The names associated on this little sheet here do not mean these are the people leading those reviews. Those are the people who said they would help to at least define them and frame them up. Because notice we've got Brian Atwater on the water quality too. And Brian, I know it sounds like he's had to sign off and is not listening. I don't think he's going to help us too much. I think he wants to dive off the board. So.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, the names associated with this was just to develop a couple of sentences on this, and if we decide to move forward on these, then at that stage is your opportunity to volunteer, and because that's a major commitment to.
Yeah, so I volunteered either John Weens or Joe Fernando for water quality too. So
I'm volunteering Jay for everything since he's not here. So,
but on your question about water quality too, yes, I think, that's my thinking on that is it would probably come at least a break of 6 months or so while we work on other things before we tackle water quality too, because it is what we're talking about. Water quality too is really things that many people look at as primary constituents of water quality. They're going to look at water quality 1 and say, why'd you do that one first? But I do think that water quality 2 has got, in terms of the salinity, temperature, DO, there's a lot more definitive science, and what we're doing there is we are going to be looking at the incremental improvements or alterations that could be made to that, but I don't think that the recommendations or the limitations on the information are going to be nearly as substantive as they are for water quality 1 projecting into the future. You want to say something on that, Liz?
Well,
that's my personal opinion, not the opinion of the Delta Independent Science Board.
One of the reasons we split the two was because they sort of fall into different purviews in terms of the agencies that that consider those constituents. And also, I think a lot of the water quality 2 constituents are driven by the physics and some of the abiotic forcings. So anyway, that was the reason for the separation. And that would, that at least I think in principle, some different members of the board might tackle water quality 2 than were involved in water quality 1.
Yeah, I think having members sign up to be on the work group is going to be very important because that's where a lot of the effort takes. And I don't know how many. I know I couldn't be on more than 2 work groups at a time without freaking out, and so that might help a little bit in terms of deciding where to go. The other topic is water reliability, and unfortunately Jay's not here, and that one has been sort of on our cards for a long time and put off for a lot of reasons because the review chapter was being done, and that really is something Jay has a keen interest in, but we haven't really talked about that. I don't know, Joe, do you have any thoughts on that, or?
Certainly, I haven't thought about it. I mean, I was going to help it out during the process. So I'm not sure because I was not here for the last meeting when we were discussing, so I might not be able to say anything substantial. But certainly I will help it out through, for example, water supplies, the flow, the climate change effects on water resources. So I think I should be able to help him out quite a bit on that.
But discussing that as a board, my view is we should put that up as the same, higher priority of this group that we're looking at for where do we put our efforts next, while we scope out the ecosystem review in conjunction with the ecosystem amendment. Water supply reliability, I think we've talked about a fair number of times. That's on our A list of things to tackle next. And I think that's why, in what you see here written up, largely from Jay with very little help from me and Joe, is really a much more detailed prospectus for water supply reliability. And so I think, even with Jay not being here, I think we could safely say that he and others are prepared to move that to a high priority for the board. And I think that's what we're discussing today. And I think we should say, yeah, well, that's what we're going to do, especially because Jay's not here.
Brian, are you still on? You did, okay. Any other thoughts? So if we put water supply reliability up there, ecosystem up there, and I'm looking at John and Joy, is ecosystem in tandem with restoration? Are we calling them 2 different things, or one flowing into the other, or done at the same time, or?
I think what we need is a preliminary planning session to see how to divide up the pie. And ecosystem should come first, and then additional restoration to follow. Does that make sense? But
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think with restoration, at least as I had been thinking about it, it dealt where we would look at that, since we did that previous review of restoration, would be at some very specific aspects of restoration that had to do with such things as landscape connectivity, water connectivity, flows, in a sense, the spatial and temporal and ecosystem dynamics that affect the effectiveness of restoration activities that are usually carried out on a parcel by parcel basis. I think that at least seemed to me, and I think the others, as a nugget that was manageable and that was a nice complement to what was going on in the ecosystem area. There's a lot of other stuff that could be done with restoration, and I agree with Joy that if we're going to kind of get into this, we really need to sit down and think about how we do it, because I think to some degree it would be, at least to some degree, the same people who would be doing both areas, which makes some sense, but maybe it's time for me to go off the board.
So if I think of the ecosystems in the context of, let's say, food web and invasive species, clearly the connectivity of the system has to be a major component of that thinking. And maybe it's valuable that if the ecosystem kind of works through that aspect of it, it may leave lead to something that would be more focused on restoration, because that would have already covered a big chunk of that. And water supply reliability is also going to talk to some extent about the connectivity, at least from a fluid point of view. So would that make sense if we started off with water supply reliability and ecosystems, an ecosystem maybe towards its end or somewhere in the process then could evolve a nugget of restoration, and then water quality we already have as being 1 and 2, and move forward on water supply reliability. That's moving forward on 2, basically, not thinking of might be others or IEP as well.
I think if we're going to really capitalize upon the potential strength of coupling ecosystem and restoration activity, in other words, putting restoration into an ecosystem context, that we don't want to do them more or less sequentially, as you were just suggesting, but and not necessarily totally simultaneously, but in a closely coordinated fashion. And I'm not sure how that then plays out in terms of people's work schedule. But I can see that we might be, for example, interviewing some of the same people in both dimensions, and it would make sense to just interview them once and ask them multiple questions rather than bring them back and say, now we're going to talk about restoration.
So would you see overlapping work groups in a sense for that then? Or one work group doing it all? Doing both?
Personally, I would see sort of a forward with maybe a couple of additional members for each one, something like that, so long as it's 5 or less.
All right, well, are there any other topics?
I'm gonna be a troublemaker again. We're dealing with one of the most disturbed ecosystems in California, and I just don't understand how we can talk about the Delta ecosystem without referring to it as a disturbed ecosystem. And of course it can be disturbed better. And so let's just talk about disturbing it better. It's a disturbed ecosystem that can be disturbed better. But I don't understand thinking about there's an ecosystem out there. It's a disturbed ecosystem out there that can be disturbed better. And so I just somehow refer to it as an ecosystem. No, it's a terribly disturbed ecosystem that needs to be disturbed better.
Well, it's an ecosystem by the definition of an ecosystem. You're right, it's a heavily modified, altered, disturbed, destructed ecosystem. And I think what potentially part of the focus of a review would be to look at what science has to say about those disturbance effects and how they can be mitigated, how you can, it's an oxymoron to say you're going to disturb it better, but I get the drift.
I like oxymorons. I think restoration's an oxymoron too. Well,
when I think of the ecosystem,
in the Anthropocene, it's an oxymoron. We can't go back.
When I'm thinking of ecosystem, I'm thinking of the chapter on ecosystem, not doing a review of the ecosystem, because more in the, if you think about food webs again and invasives, well, clearly invasives by definition is a disturbed ecosystem. And in the same with restoration, I'm not sure it's ecosystem restoration, it's restoration, and then the question of what you're restoring is part of the review process. So I understand what you're saying, but I'm not sure
what it means.
We're not proposing an ecosystem, or at least I'm not. ecosystem review or an ecosystem restoration review. It's a restoration or, I want to say, components of the ecosystem, functional components.
I look at it that, like with most of our thematic reviews, it's where's our science on ecosystem processes and function, where's our science on the perturbations of the ecosystem in terms of what the ecosystem is providing, both for, biota, human, social needs, and is that science adequate, and where does it need to be bolstered, or where should it be modified, or do we have the appropriate focus on different aspects of ecosystem science? So we start with that, and then we'll bring in the semantics and everything, but it'll, so we'll get there.
Microphone.
Yeah, so let's just talk about them as the ecosystem science review and the restoration science review. And then we use what's in the literature, and sometimes it will agree 100% that it's not at all restoration, but that's what's in the literature.
Well, what I was going to suggest, which gets along that line, is to, if we decide to go with the ones we've talked about, then the next step is to get a work group and put together a draft prospectus. And when doing that, it makes you think more explicitly about what you're going to do. And at that stage, the title may change. The ecosystem people may decide it's, we want to do fish and food webs, and that's going to be the review. Or fish and flows like the other one was. It wasn't, it's a more narrower focus, but that can be something that group can discuss, because then they're committing to work on that and bring it back to the group as a whole, and we can begin to flush those prospecti out a little bit more explicitly. John?
Yeah, a thought just occurred to me that there's a fairly intense debate going on now in the restoration ecology community about novel ecosystems. And novel ecosystems, quite apart from the restoration context, are part of that reality that Dick referred to. And people like Peter Moyle have talked about that with reference to fish systems. So there is, and that clearly involves invasives as well as habitat alteration, flow alteration, those sorts of things. So maybe that provides a hook that we can link both those efforts to and explore them in terms of the permutations in one direction or the other. But there is a developing body of science that underlies that, which is would be fun to investigate because it is contentious.
It's been done.
Joe?
I'm not an ecosystems expert, but I hope not. When you say that novel ecosystems, that means some type of restoration for good, right? To come to a new state from existing state. That's basically some type of restoration. These are semantics, but is there anything very special?
I think the debate has to do with whether or not the focus of restoration should accept the fact that we are dealing with novel ecosystems that are quite different from those that historically existed. And therefore you can't go back and you need to work within that framework of novelty. Or whether the objective of restoration is to somehow recreate the former historical state. And within the restoration community there's a debate going on between people who are old and out of touch and people who know what's going on.
But can you ever go back to the same state? Probably not, right? So it will be a novel here.
Yeah.
So I just want to remind everyone that we also have works in progress. So I'm trying to envision like a Gantt chart. And so we have water quality is still continuing, but will be coming to an end. We've got the big monitoring review that's going to, probably take quite a long amount of time. So I'm thinking about the composition of the board and like how to stagger these activities. And I'll just throw out the idea that given our expertise and given the things that are ongoing, that we might want to think about the water reliability, the ecosystem or something along those lines, and then the IEP review. And that would engage most members of the board and sort of follow on some of the other activities. So anyway, I'll just put that out there.
I agree with you. I think that's sort of where we are in terms of people's time commitments, So let me make sure we have everything on the table. First, the simple question is there any, other than IEP, are there any other of these topics that anyone wants to make a case for should be moved up to a major thematic one? Hearing none. The IEP programmatic review, we talked about that this morning, and what are your thoughts about putting that also up in the what you suggested, in the top tier? Is there support for that?
Yeah, and maybe thinking about that one phasing in as water quality is brought to completion.
When's that going to be?
Soon.
We'll get to that next. Yeah, I mean, I think the thinking on IEP programmatic, and we talked about it a bit this morning, is that it should be up there in pretty high priority, because while we gear up with the RFP and getting a contractor on board for some of the survey and censusing for the bigger monitoring enterprise review, it would be really useful if we could address this IEP programmatic review. That should not be, well, who's speaking here? Is it that Collier guy? That shouldn't take too long. It should be fairly straightforward. I think that shouldn't be more than, I don't know, I'm looking at Vince and Liz, but I'm thinking 6 to 8 months. I mean, it really should be, it's a programmatic review. It's a fairly straightforward. So it should be quick.
So the three of you sort of volunteering to be the work group for that?
Vince volunteered this morning to frame it up, not to be the work group
And if
necessarily.
we need a fourth, John.
Well, I think if we're going to decide to do it, now's the time to pick the work group who would then be doing the prospectus and carrying it forward. So I guess, does anybody want to volunteer for that? So are you in then, Tracy?
I'll be in, because I've felt that IEP is, we've had this request for a long time, and I think we should address it, and I have a certain amount of desire to do so.
Dick? Okay, Dick? Anyone else? And Liz? You in as well, Vince? Okay, we have 4. One have a minimum of 3. We got 4, so that's set. And the next one, I guess, is the ecosystem. I'm looking at. Now you also have monitoring, which is fine, but I'll volunteer for the ecosystem as one. Okay, that's fair. Yeah.
I will,
And
because
Joy?
it overlaps a lot with restoration.
Right. Anyone else? No, Vince has got monitoring.
Yeah, I think with the monitoring and the IEP, I have to fall into that one too.
Yay.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, okay, so now we have 4 for that to move forward. Water supply reliability. Joe, and we'll volunteer Jay twice. Do we need, that'll probably take a while. We do have by the way, I forgot to mention, on our closed session at lunch, we talked about board member replacements. But that's just an open discussion. But if we get a new board person coming in, we can ask them to join that group as well, because that would make sense.
And also, I think Jay wants to do a quick initial review first on that, according to the write-up here. So that can be quick, and then the new board member comes in, we can kind of include, hopefully, the person.
Okay, so right now, the way I'm looking at it is we have pretty much everybody everyone's assigned to one, and a number of us are.
No, but he said that it may happen in
What's
the
that?
future that it was co-ops.
Which is the other one you're on? Oh, monitoring, right, I forgot about monitoring. Yeah, so everybody would be on 2 boards already, or 2 work groups, and nobody more than that, right? Jay's only on, I guess, the 1, or is Jay on monitoring? But he's got water supply reliability. Okay, well, I think we've made a lot of progress. Is everyone happy with the way we're going now? As far as I see it, we got 3 more new things, and we've got work groups and water supply, water quality. One is the one that was moved back, and restoration is still kind of in a fuzzy zone, moving forward in some sort of overlapping tandem, but a discussion on that. Anyone? Are people happy with that, or? This is a major commitment. We sign off, and now they could all fall apart if the prospectus never surfaces, but Edmund, you're looking like you have a question.
No questions. We're going to write reminder, remind ISB to draft prospectus.
Okay, yes. So that would be your next assignment, is to start meeting and working on the details of or at least maybe at this stage, we have some ideas down, but I don't know that you're necessarily held to those at this stage, and think about what would you really do in terms of a prospectus, and maybe at least start out with a bulletized objectives and thinking about a process, and just starting to work it through, and maybe at our next meeting, we could present, if anyone's moved forward enough, we could present some of that. And Edmund, if you could let Jay know, he's already got a prospectus written, but let him know that he's been assigned to that.
Will do.
He has the opportunity to volunteer for that, I should say, or dis-volunteer. Any other thoughts, questions? All right, well, if anyone feels unhappy with this, you can bring it up at the next meeting and we can reconsider. It looks like it's going to be too much. No further thoughts? We have one public comment, I think, on this topic. Tom? Yes.
I am Tom Zuckerman from the Central Delta Water Agency. I was listening to you earlier today about garbling the introductions and so forth. So anyway, I had a pretty clear idea what I wanted to say until I listened to the conversation that's taken place in the last few minutes. And part of the problem that I have is I don't know exactly what the scope of what you're calling Water Quality 1 is. I don't know if there's a document that I haven't seen or hasn't been circulated or whatever. Then I want you to take that into consideration as I speak. Oh, is this it? Oh, okay. Well, then I have seen it. And that was the reason why I wanted to say something. I think there's a general tendency to skip over some of the more basic water quality issues in the Delta. And part of it I would put at the foot of a kind of a reinterpretation of the dual goals type thing in terms of looking at water supply reliability as being something of water that's taken out of the Delta and served other places in the state. And a great tendency to overlook the fact that when we're talking about water supply reliability, we need to include the Delta in that regard. And if you look at the towards the bottom of page 1 of your ideas, there's a kind of an omission there to recognize that we're really talking about a water supply for the Delta itself. We're just talking about every place else. What spurred me on this subject was, and I apologize because I was a panelist when you were talking about future ideas out on the boat, and I was one of the ones that was encouraging you to look at water quality, is I don't think there's been a sophisticated look at the water quality needs of the Delta itself. There's been a lot of politics associated with it. The State Water Resources Control Board periodically reduces the water quality standards in the Delta, presumably because somebody else needs the water more than the Delta does or the fish do or whatever. But it kind of came up earlier in a couple of ways. One, when the gentleman from the Department of Water Resources was talking about the Suisun Marsh, he just sort of offhandedly said, well, we just have to assume that the water quality is going to get worse as time goes on because there's greater demands to take water out of the Delta and serve it somewhere else, and that's kind of an inevitability. Well, if you accept that argument, you're basically accepting the demise of the Delta because it's very, very dependent upon maintaining certain water quality parameters. The one about the 2 parts per thousand of water or salinity for the marsh is a perfect example of that. There are thresholds beyond which you can't really go, and somebody has to come out, stand up on their hind feet, and basically declare that there are limits beyond which we can't go. I don't think, listening, I actually got into a kind of a impolite reference to the former lead scientist on this subject. But I don't think there is a good understanding of why, when we have a largely an organic soil delta, that nature presented to us, it has completely different drainage requirements or obstacles than mineral soils do. People don't understand that you can't just take the work of the Riverside Salinity Laboratory and apply it to the soils in the Delta. You can't over-irrigate and wash things down because there's a water table underneath, and you're accumulating salts all the time in the top 6 inches of the soil, and it's inevitable. The other thing that you need to, it's what the soil salinity is what a plant is looking at. It's not what the water quality is in the channel. And it's a time warp thing where you get accumulation of salinity in the soils depending upon the conditions and the management capabilities and so forth. I really think it's important that if somebody other than the State Water Resources Control Board is going to be looking at these issues, that you take a deeper dive into the subject matter. And I hope I'm not offending anybody again, which I did, I think, last time around, but I hope you'll do this. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Tom. Any questions?
Thank you.
It's a good segue. As I'm wrapping this particular issue up, right now I don't think we have anything coming down the pipe that I'm aware of being requested of us to do, other than somewhere down the line the ecosystem amendment review of the science, I imagine. Other than that, I'm not aware of anything else unless I've washed it out of my mind. So I think it is valuable for us to think about what reviews we want to do and get ourselves busy, because then we can be very judicious in accepting requests to do other kinds of reviews that can take up a lot of our time. And I'm not going to recognize Darcy because she's going to tell me I forgot a list of things. Go ahead.
Maybe not a list, but we do believe that the Delta Science Plan will be coming to you for review sometime in 2018.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah. Okay, without any further discussion, we'll move on to the next item, which is the status on the water quality review.
Steve, just
sorry.
if I comment,
Yeah.
because Darcy mentioned that, we were having a running document of all the things that were coming with like a calendar.
Yes.
Could we update that and circulate that again?
Yeah, I think it went out to us just within the last month or so.
Yeah, so the last version was in July. So we can definitely send out a revised one based on the current understanding. And then the new work groups can kind of like do a time frame of when they envision having prospectus done and starting the process of writing the review.
Yeah, and that's where I was getting my information. And by that particular version in July, the 2018, the only thing on our calendar was the monitoring review. The Delta plan was not yet on it. So, okay, water, but the water quality review, by the way, was done by the end of the year, so it wasn't on by 2018. So.
No, the water quality is going to be, we expect to give the final draft probably next Friday. I'm just kidding. So we did complete a draft of the Water Quality 1 review. Tom, thank you very much for your comments. Water Quality 1, again, explicitly is not going to be about salinity. That's coming next. But that's one of the touch points that we know we're going to get in terms of public feedback on the draft that we're hoping to release soon. So we completed the draft. We gave it individually to members of the other board members. It's Vince, Liz, myself, with a great deal of help from Tricia. And Vince, Liz, jump in anytime if I get something misconstrued or flat out wrong. We've asked for comments on from the board sort of in two phases from individual board members. First, looking at the executive summary, or what we're now calling the summary, as well as the introduction, which is a description of what we did and why we did it. We wanted to know, is this reasonable to release to the public? We got comments back from the board. Everybody who responded said yes, it was reasonable to release to the public. So we released that 2 days ago, was it, Edmund?
That's correct.
Yeah, so 2 days ago, we posted publicly the executive summary, which largely consists of the findings and recommendations, as well as the introduction, which gives the context and the process we went through. We also have asked board members for comments on the full draft. By 3 days ago, we've gotten comments from 2 or 3 board members, I believe. A lot of people responded on just the executive summary and the context and process. But basically, we're going to wait for, what we're saying now is we've released the findings and recommendations. It's open to the public, posted. We are looking for feedback from that, and what we're discussing right now, I think, is how long to get feedback on that and what should we do about releasing a full draft to the public. The three of us, have not talked about that. We don't have an opinion on that. My personal opinion is that we should probably have another week for any board comments on the full draft. We should then work on redoing the draft, and presuming that we don't have major issues from the board, releasing that to the public as soon as we can. And at that point, we'll have a public comment period and start trying to finish this thing off. So that's my thinking, just made up as I was talking. And I'm curious, Liz and Vince especially, what do you guys think about that approach? And I would also ask the board if you have any comments that you want to make publicly now that there is on the findings and recommendations, which have some things that I think are going to generate some discussion from the public. I'd be curious about what the board members think thus far. Dick, you, and I'd love to talk about your comments as well, so. Okay. Oh, yeah, do I have to recognize you? Okay.
Yes.
Steve, yeah. I think you're supposed to recognize yourself.
The coverage of the monitoring, because a large part of the monitoring, of course, is dealing with water quality parameters. Do you see that you've covered that at all that would ease the burden on the monitoring review, or is that something you sort of are not specifically covering because it's being covered by the monitoring? Or I know you have the executive summary, there's some references to that. What are your thoughts?
Just quickly, I'd say my sense is, and I think both Vince and Liz should jump in, and Tricia as well, we've covered the monitoring from the standpoint of the monitoring of these certain aspects of water quality. How is the data sharing? How is the support for management decisions? But we haven't really, the monitoring enterprise review is really that bigger picture about how well are we doing monitoring across the region among all these constituents, and what areas are there where we can improve it, where we can make it more efficient. Here we're more saying, is the monitoring that's being done for these water quality constituents, being chemical contaminants, nutrients primarily, but also drinking water and alkotoxins, is that adequate to support management decisions? And what we're saying is, we don't get a clear sense from the region that people really understand how that monitoring is supporting the management decisions of those constituents. But it's not, it touches on it, but that's something we struggle with all the time, was that we could make this whole thing for water quality all about monitoring, but we wanted to focus more on the science behind it rather than the processes of monitoring. Vince, you're on both.
I was just going to say that it's really, especially with the quotes that we used from the respondents to the question, we're talking about almost the concept of monitoring and how it's used, not really about how monitoring is done or is it sufficient in terms of some of the things that we're looking at in the monitoring report or the monitoring enterprise review. We really were very, very specific on that, because I would say that in our interviews, that was the major topic that people brought up, was the monitoring and the aspects of the monitoring. So the survey that was summarized by Tricia does have several questions related to monitoring, but I don't know if you agree with me. There was the concept, the big picture about monitoring, not the specifics that we covered.
I guess just to build on that, I mean, I think our, some of the, our findings and recommendations, so they do address monitoring and data, but only in sort of a narrow context, not in the broad context of that the monitoring enterprise will do, or that we expect it to do.
So your conclusions will be set in a way that won't necessarily contradict what might be coming in a more detailed monitoring. Okay.
Again, they're in different contexts, because in the monitoring review, we're going to be looking at this same information in a very different way than we were looking at it for here, where we relied very much on the opinions expressed in these questionnaires and interviews.
Okay, any other?
So any other comments from the board on the findings and recommendations, which is the only part that we can publicly discuss because we've not yet released a full draft?
So your intent right now is to get individual board member comments by the end of...
I would say one more week, because we did ask for them by Monday. So let's say by Friday next week, whatever day that is.
And then you'd release
22nd.
Do the modifications, release the public draft.
Right.
And then want to have another, of course, board discussion with our next meeting.
So we'll release a public draft, and then we will give an official comment period of, what's our, Darcy, Edmund, is it 2 weeks, 3 weeks?
30 days.
I don't know. 3 days?
I think we typically do 30 days.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll release the draft as soon as we can practicably do that, and then have a 30-day comment period and see where we are at that point. And probably discuss that with the board before we decide what the next steps are.
So that'll probably be a major topic for November then, and not October?
Yep.
Okay. I believe we have public comment.
Hi, Laura Volpe with State and Federal Contractors Water Agency. I just had a chance to look at this, but one thing that wasn't listed, and I'm not sure if it will be in the full report, is the issue of sediment quality and sediment toxicity to benthic inverts. I don't know if that's part of the review. If it's not, maybe you could consider doing it in the water quality review too. A lot of certainly legacy contaminants, mercury, the DDT, PCBs are certainly accumulate in sediment, but also, as I understand it, the pyrethroids, current chemicals and other chemicals can accumulate in sediment as well, and any toxicity to benthic invertebrates could transfer to that benthic food web. So I just wanted to point that out and ask for clarification on that, either in this report or consider putting it in the water quality review too.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, we do have in the full draft that we're working on now, we do have sediment covered under some of the constituent attributes, but we probably could enhance it in some of the ones.
And we also have several comments that made more specific recommendations than we were looking for about those topics as well.
Thanks. Tom, your card says 10/11. Were you going to talk again, or? I shouldn't have even asked, yeah.
To say in the first go-around, but of course I didn't, because I was, water supply reliability in the Delta is a kind of a funny subject. We're never going to be short of water in the Delta. It's impossible. The ocean makes up for any, overuse or over-diversion or whatever it is. So when you're talking about water supply reliability, you can't get away from the water quality topic in that. What was bothering me about this document was that it seemed to just slide over the subjects of salinity particularly and assume that somebody else was doing it or whatever. And I don't know if it's explicit that it's in water quality 2 that you're going to be doing it, or
our prospectus, we explicitly said salinity, temperature, and DO will not be covered in this because it's a huge subject. It's got a whole different range of stakeholders than we have for pesticides, for mercury. But it is definitely a water quality issue, and we are definitely going to cover it in water quality too.
Okay.
And we are definitely expecting a lot of blowback from the public as to why the heck didn't you cover it in water quality 1.
Okay.
So you can be the vanguard of that pushback. And we're ready. We think we're ready. We probably aren't, but anyways.
Well, the good news is I'm going off to Japan for another month, so I won't be in your hair for a while.
Okay, so we're going to get this wrapped up in a month, folks.
But the other thing on the water supply reliability, you've got to look at more than just the Delta on this stuff. You've got to look at all these other opportunities of things that we're working on and need to encourage and so forth, so that the whole state isn't looking to the Delta to solve its water problems. I think you all understand that. Thank you.
Okay, any other thoughts or questions on water quality?
We're asking for any board comments on the draft that you have by the 22nd of September, at which point we will then work on it and plan to have a draft. Let's see, so we will want to have a draft then by the October meeting so that we can share it with the board and make it public after that, I think is our. Then we have 30 days and we can hopefully get comments back quickly.
Just, so you're saying we want a public draft in advance of the October meeting?
No, I think we want to get well, let's see, we want to get comments, we want to have a draft.
So the draft will be released by the October meeting.
Yeah, I think so. I think we would like to have the draft released by the October meeting so we can get a 30-day comment period and have comments in by November or shortly thereafter that we can work on, and finalize it by the end of 2017, which is when we promised our chair we would. Did we promise, or did we just?
I think you promised yourself when you were chair.
Yeah, you might be right.
When it first
You know,
started.
I lied to myself.
Is this another version than the one we commented recently?
Well, it's just the initial sections. So
Oh.
it's just the,
Full version.
yeah.
What you,
the
I should have
summary
clarified,
and
what you have
intro.
now, what we have just posted, we sent a draft out to the entire board individually. We got comments back, and we especially asked for comments on that first executives, the summary and the introduction. We took those comments, made modifications, and released that. So what is sitting here as these first couple of sections is not the same draft you have. So we should probably, how should we do that, Liz and Vince? Should we just provide that, the full draft with these changed first two sections?
Yeah,
back to the
we have
board?
already gotten response from some people on the latter part of the
Right,
document.
right.
We just haven't
Which is-
incorporated them yet, because we wanted to concentrate on getting this out. So what I think we really want especially.
comments on the
is comments
sections.
on the second half of it, or
Right, yeah.
that's the
Right.
the important point.
All
If they
we're-
want to comment on this, that's
They can do that too.
fine.
So Edmund, I'll work with you to craft a message to send to the full board as to what, make sure they're clear on what we're asking for by the end of next week. Okay.
Anything else on that topic? Vince?
We really want to thank Joy and Brian for really taking the first cut at this, that pointing out some things that really were very important reorganization and really very, very valuable comments, and it made it much better and easy for us to get out. So thanks, both of you.
Well, we're actually an hour ahead of schedule. Moving to item 12, which is just the preparation for the October-November meetings. The October is a teleconference, and it looks like two of the things we'll talk about is of course an update on the monitoring and the water quality status. That by that time we would have all seen the public release draft, right? The full draft. So, we could provide our initial public comments at that stage while you're waiting for the rest of the public comments. Anything else that's major for that October? I'm looking at Edmund who's taking the notes.
Do we want to do a status update of where everyone is with prospectus planning?
Yes, perfect, yes. Let's put that on and put each of those, whatever 3 or 4 we decided to do, and we'll ask for an update on the prospectus. And if people have narrowed it down to some bullets and topics, I think it's okay for them to, bring those up and start discussing them at that stage.
And do we want to table the one-pager discussion for November, or do we want to have it discussed in October too?
I'm hearing October, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we might have a reasonably long October. And then in the November meeting, I think I guess the major topics for November, one would be, and that's the face-to-face, and we're deciding whether to have a two-day meeting or a one-day meeting. We're still having that discussion, but one of the things was an update on the new reviews, and then that would be, another thing would be the full discussion of the water quality, because by then you'll have gotten the public comments back. I believe those are probably two of the main items. But one thing to think about, we don't need to decide today, is if we decide to go for a one-day meeting, there may be an opportunity for a half a day of small group discussions, and that might be another time for these new work groups to spend a good, significant amount of time before that November meeting and discuss, their prospectus development on face-to-face. So that would be like a half a day and then a full day meeting.
And it sounds like, because some people can't make it, we've talked about doing that November meeting earlier in the week on Tuesday and Wednesday, I think, versus Thursday, Friday. That doesn't work for a number of board members. So I think what we're saying is, and we had a problem with the Thursday being a conflict with the council meeting. So I think what we're thinking about is, let's plan to have the full ISB meeting on Friday of that week, and Thursday, people should start planning their travel, because obviously hotels are getting hard to get in this city as it gets economically revitalized, which is a good thing, but it's bad for us. So let's plan on Thursday to have these small work group meetings, potentially a limited ISB meeting if we need it because of the agenda. If our agenda gets too full, we might have a half-day ISB and then a full day on Friday.
Is that all right?
Yeah, but like I said, we should probably coordinate with the council first before making any decision to change the meeting date. So I think we'll have a firmer understanding in October, or as soon as we can, we'll let you guys know.
I think as soon as we can.
Yeah, as soon as we can, because the hotels are so hard. And I would say the thing we can say to move forward with is a one full day scheduled board meeting
on Friday,
and then half a day of small group meetings or so. And given the fact that we have a couple people that can't make it on the 13th and 14th, but as far as I know, everybody can make it on the 16th and 17th. So that would be our preferred date if we can do it.
Okay.
So we'll confirm that once we talk to the council. Okay, I guess we're, and they will also try and get us some block hotel bookings. And again, those block bookings are for those to use if you want. It's an option that if you don't want to search for hotels, they'll find us one. But if you have your favorite hotel, feel free to use that. Topics. Darcy, are you doing this? Action items?
I can if you would like. I have about 5 pages of notes though, so let me flip back. And Edmund and Steve, if you can catch anything that I missed. So you voted to approve the CSO memos, and so we will finalize those and post them and circulate them. The one-pager, Tricia will make some initial changes and circulate it to the full ISB for additional comments. On your upcoming reviews, I have, I'm sorry, I'm skipping around. On the upcoming one-pagers, I have Vince and Joy willing to help out with one for restoration, and Steve for fish and flows. And then we would plan on doing these for all future reviews. And I don't know, Dick, if you'd want to circle back and do one for Delta's Place, but we can do that. Okay. Yes, yeah. Okay, so we will keep using WebEx for teleconferences. For upcoming reviews, water supply reliability will be Jay, Joe, and potentially the new ISB member. IEP programmatic review, which will happen after the Water Quality 1 review, and that will be Tracy, Dick, Liz, and Vince. For ecosystem science, I have Steve, John, Joy, and Dick. Ongoing reviews, water quality, and monitoring enterprise review. I don't know if you want me to, you all know who you are. So the direction is to start meeting and draft some prospectus documents, and then we will also update the Gantt chart and provide you with sort of a running list of what, the updated running list of what you have going on. And then, let's see, for the water quality review, what I wrote down, but I think we'll work on it and refine it. I have comments are due on what you have before you. They're due on Friday the 22nd, back to Tracy and the rest of the work group. The work group will revise and send out a public draft in time for the October meeting. There will be a 30-day review, and then the hope is to finalize that review by the end of 2017. And then for the October meeting, I have the Monitoring Enterprise Review, the Water Quality Review, Prospectus Planning, and the Adaptive Management one-pager. For November, we're still up in the air as far as dates, but maybe a day and a half, and an update on new reviews, a full discussion on water quality, and then some potential small group discussions, and then we will block hotel rooms for you. Did I miss anything, Edmund?
I think you have the major ones.
Yeah, and the water quality review, just a reminder that, Edmund, if you could send us out that reminder, but maybe attach the thing we're supposed to be reviewing, so we're not reviewing an earlier something or other.
So we'll coordinate with Tracy.
And then tomorrow, I think we're now rescheduled for 8 o'clock at the same location.
Yeah, so I was busy sending out some emails, so hopefully people are checking, and I'll try to give a few phone calls. But we're set for 8 a.m. tomorrow at DWR's West Sacramento office.
Okay. Anything else from the board? Any public comments for things not on the agenda? Well, thank you, everybody, for being so efficient and getting us done quickly. See you tomorrow morning, crack of dawn.